Soundings Audiobooks presents an unabridged recording of Candleford Green, written by Flora Thompson, read by Karen Cass. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Soundings, Whitley Bay, NE26 2JT. CD 1. Chapter 1. From one small world to another. Laura sat up beside her father on the high front seat of the spring cart and waved to the neighbours. "Goodbye, Laura, goodbye," they called. "Mind you be a good gal now." And Laura, as she turned to smile and wave back to them, tried not to look too conscious of her new frock and hat and the brand-new trunk with her initials roped onto the back seat. As the cart moved on, more women came to their doors to see what the sound of wheels meant at that time in the morning. It was not the coalman's or the fishhawker's day, the baker was not due for hours, and the appearance of any other wheeled vehicle than theirs always caused a mild sensation in that secluded hamlet. When they saw Laura and her new trunk, the women remained on their doorsteps to wave their farewells. Then, before the cart had turned into the road from the rutted lane, little groups began forming. Her going seemed to be causing quite a stir in the hamlet, not because the sight of a young girl going out into the world to earn her own living was an uncommon one there. All the hamlet girls left home for that purpose, some of them at a much earlier age than Laura. But they usually went on foot, carrying bundles, or their fathers pushed their boxes on wheelbarrows to the railway station in the nearest town the night before, while for Laura's departure, the innkeeper's pony and cart had been hired. That, of course, was because Candleford Green, although only 8 miles distant, was on another line of railway than that which ran through the market town, and to have gone there by train would have meant 2 changes and a long wait at the junction. But the spring cart brought a spice of novelty into her departure, which made something to talk about, as the saying went there. At the beginning of the 1890s, any new subject for conversation was precious in such places. Laura was 14 and a half, and the thick pigtail of hair which had so far hung down her back had that morning been looped up once and tied with a big black ribbon bow on her neck. When they had first known that she was to go to work in the post office at Candleford Green, her mother had wondered if she ought not to wear her hair done up with hairpins, grown-up fashion. But when she saw a girl behind the post office counter at Shurston, wearing hers in a loop with a bow, she had felt sure that was the proper way for Laura to do hers. So the ribbon was bought. Black, of course, for her mother said the bright-coloured ribbons most country girls wore made them look like horses, all plaited and beribboned for a fair. "And mind you sponge and press it often," she had said, "for it cost good money, and when you come to buy your own clothes, always buy the best you can afford. It pays in the end." But Laura could not bear to think of her mother just then. The parting was too recent. So she thought of her new trunk. This contained, as well as her everyday clothes and her personal treasures, including her collection of pressed flowers, a lock of her baby brother's fair hair, and a penny exercise book, presented by her brother Edmund and inscribed by him, "Laura's Journal," in which she had promised to write every night what her mother had spoken of as 3 of everything, all made of stout white calico and trimmed with crochet edging. "No child of mine," her mother had often declared, "shall go out in the world without a good outfit. I'd rather starve." And when the time had come to get Laura ready for Candleford Green, the calico, bought secretly from time to time in lengths, had been brought out from its hiding place to be made up and trimmed with the edging she had been making for months. "I told you it would come in handy for something at some time," she had said. But Laura knew by her arch little smile she had meant it for her all along. Her father had made and polished the trunk and studded it with her initials in bright brass-headed nails, and deep down in one corner of it, wrapped in tissue paper, was the new half-crown he had given her. The contents of the trunk, the clothes she was wearing, youth and health, and a meagre education, plus a curious assortment of scraps of knowledge she had picked up in the course of her reading, were her only assets. In fitting her out, Her parents had done all they could for her. They had 4 younger children now to be provided for. Her future must depend upon herself and what opportunities might offer. But she had no idea of the slenderness of her equipment for life, and no fears for the distant future which stretched before her, years and years in which anything might happen. She could not imagine herself married or old, and it did not seem possible that she would ever die. Any qualms she felt were for the immediate future, when she, who had so far only known her cottage home and the homes of a few relatives, would be living in someone else's house, where she would work and be paid for her work, and where the work she was to do had still to be learned. She was much afraid she would not know what she ought to do, or where to find things, or would make mistakes and be thought stupid. The postmistress of Candleford Green, it was true, was no stranger, but an old girlhood's friend of her mother. Laura had been to her house several times and had liked her, and she thought Miss Lane had liked her, but that only seemed to make the new relationship more difficult. Should she treat Miss Lane as an old friend of the family, or strictly as a new employer? Her mother, when appealed to, had laughed and said, "God bless the child, always looking for trouble. What is there to worry about? Just be your own natural self, and Dorcas, I'm sure, will be hers. Though when it comes to that, perhaps you'd better not go on cousin Dorcasing her. That was all right when you were a visitor, but now it had better be Miss Lane." As they lurched out of the rutted road which led round the hamlet, her father urged on the pony. He was not a patient man, and there had been too many farewells to suit his taste. "What a lot," he muttered. "You can't so much as hire a horse and cart for a day without creating a 9 days' wonder in this place." But Laura thought it was kind of the neighbours to wish her well. "Go and get rich and fat," kind old Mrs. Braby had advised, "and whatever you do, don't you forget them at home." Rich she could never be. Her starting salary of £0.50 a week would leave no margin for saving, and getting fat seemed more improbable still to tall, lanky 14. "Like a Molin, all legs and wings," as the neighbours had often called her, but she would never forget those at home. That she could promise. She turned and looked back over green cornfields at the huddle of grey cottages, one of which was her home, and pictured her mother ironing and her little sisters playing round the doorway, and wondered if her favourite brother would miss her when he came home from school, and if he would remember to water her garden and give her white rabbit, Florizel, plenty of green leaves, and if he would care to read her new journal when she sent it to him, or would think it silly, as he sometimes did, her writing. But it was May, and the warm wind dried her eyes and soothed her sore eyelids, and the roadside banks were covered with the tiny spring flowers she loved. Stitchwort and celandine, and whole sheets of speedwell, which Laura knew as angel's eyes, and somewhere in the budding green hedgerow a blackbird was singing. Who could be sad on such a day? At one place she saw cowslips in a meadow, and asked her father to wait while she gathered a bunch to take as an offering to Miss Lane. Back in her seat, she buried her face in the big, fragrant bunch, and ever after, the scent of cowslips reminded her of that morning in May. When, about midday, they passed through a village, she held the reins while her father went into the inn for a pint of ale for himself, and brought out for her a tall tumbler of sweet fizzing orangeade. She sat in state on her high seat, and sipped it gently in the grown-up way she had seen farmers' wives in gigs sipping their drinks before the inn at home, and it pleased her to imagine that the elderly clergyman who glanced her way in passing was wondering who that interesting-looking girl in the spring cart could be, although she knew very well in sober fact he was more probably thinking about his next Sunday's sermon, or trying to decide whether or not he owed a parochial call at the next house he had to pass. At 14, it is intolerable to resign every claim to distinction. Her hair was soft and thick and brown, and she had rather nice brown eyes, and the fresh complexion of country youth, but those were her only assets in the way of good looks. "You'll never be annoyed by people turning round in the street to have another look at you," her mother had often told her. And sometimes, if Laura looked dashed, she would add, "But that cuts both ways. If you're no beauty, Be thankful you're not a freak." So she had nothing to pride herself upon in that respect, and being country-born and with little education, she knew herself to be ignorant. And as to goodness, well, no one but herself knew how far she fell short of that. So, rather than sink into nothingness in her own estimation, she chose to imagine herself interesting-looking. Candleford Green was taking its afternoon nap when they arrived. The large, irregular square of turf which gave the village its name was deserted but for one grazing donkey and a flock of geese, which came cackling with outstretched necks towards the spring cart to investigate. The children, who at other times played there, were in school, and their fathers were at work in the fields, or in workshops, or at their different jobs in Candleford town. The doors of the row of shops which ran along one side of the green were open. A man in a white grocer's apron stood yawning and stretching his arms in one doorway. An old grey sheepdog slept in the exact middle of the road. The church clock chimed, then struck 3. But those were the only signs of life. For it was Monday, and the women of the place were too busy with their washing to promenade with their perambulators in front of the shops, as on other afternoons. On the farther, less populated side of the green, a white horse stood under a tree outside the smithy, waiting its turn to be shod, and from within, as the spring cart drew up, the ring of the anvil and the roar of the bellows could be heard. Attached to the smithy was a long, low white house which might have been taken for an ordinary cottage of the more substantial kind, but for a scarlet-painted letterbox let into the wall beneath the window at one end. Over the window was a painted board which informed the public that the building was Candleford Green Post and Telegraph Office. At the other end of the building, above the door of the smithy, was another board which read Dorcas Lane, Shoeing and General Smith. Except for the sounds of the forge and the white horse dozing beneath the oak tree, that side of the green appeared even more somnolent than the shopping side. Their arrival had not been unobserved, however, for as the cart drew up, a young smith darted from the forge and, seizing Laura's trunk, bore it away on his shoulder as if it weighed no more than a feather. "Ma'am, the new miss has come," they heard him call as he reached the back door of the house, and a moment later the post office doorbell went ping-ping, and Miss Lane herself stepped out to welcome her new assistant. Miss Lane was not a tall woman and was slightly built, but an erect carriage, a commanding air, and the rustle, as she walked, of the rich silks she favoured, gave her what was then known as a presence. Bright, dark, almost black eyes were the only noticeable feature in her sallow but not otherwise unpleasing countenance. Ordinarily quietly observant, those eyes could disconcert with a flash of recognition of motives, sparkle with malice, or, more rarely, soften with sympathy. That afternoon, over a deep prune-coloured gown, she wore a small black satin apron, embroidered almost to stiffness with jet beads, and, in accordance with fashion, her still luxurious black hair was plaited into a coronet above a curled fringe. Not quite the Dorcas Lane, Shoeing and General Smith that might have been expected after reading her signboard. Had she lived a century earlier, or half a century later, she would probably have been found at the forge with a sledgehammer in her hand, for she had indomitable energy and a passion for doing and making things. But hers was an age when any work outside the four walls of a home was taboo for any woman who had any pretensions to refinement, and she had to content herself with keeping the books and attending to the correspondence of the old family business she had inherited. She had found one other outlet for her energy in her post office work, which also provided her with entertainment in the supervision of her neighbours' affairs and the study and analysis of their motives. This may sound terrifying, as now related, but there was nothing terrifying about Miss Lane. She kept the secrets with which she was entrusted in the course of her official duties most honourably, and if she laughed at some of her customers' foibles, she laughed secretly. Clever was the general village description of her. "She's a clever one, that Miss Lane, as sharp as vinegar, but not bad in her way," people would afterwards say to Laura. Only her 2 or 3 enemies said that if she had lived at one time she'd have been burned as a witch. That afternoon she was in her most gracious mood. "You've come just at the right time," she said, kissing Laura. "I've had a most terrible rush. 6 in at once for postal orders and whatnot, and the telegraph bell ringing like mad all the while. But it's over now, I think, for the time being, and the afternoon mail is not due for an hour, so come inside, do, both of you, and we'll have a nice cup of tea before the evening's work begins." Laura experienced a slight shock when she heard of this recent pressure of business. How, she thought, would she ever be able to cope with such rushes? But she need not have feared. The rushes at Candleford Green Post Office existed chiefly in the imagination of the postmistress, who loved to make her office appear more busy and important than it was in reality. Her father could not stay to tea, as he had his Candleford relations to visit, and Laura watched him drive away with the sinking feeling of one whose last link with a known world is vanishing. But before the day was out, her childhood's life seemed long ago and far away to her. There was so much to see and hear and try to grasp in the new one. As she followed her new employer through the little office and out to the big front living kitchen, the hands of the grandfather's clock pointed to 4:15. It was really only 3:15, and the post office clock gave that time exactly. But the house clocks were purposely kept half an hour fast, and meals and other domestic matters were timed by them. To keep thus ahead of time was an old custom in many country families, which was probably instituted to ensure the early rising of man and maid in the days when 5 or even 4 o'clock was not thought an unreasonably early hour at which to begin the day's work. The Smiths still began work at 6, and Zillah the maid was downstairs before 7, by which time Miss Lane, and later Laura, was also up and sorting the morning mail. The kitchen was a large room with a flagstone floor and 2 windows, beneath which stood a long, solid-looking table large enough to accommodate the whole household at mealtimes. The foreman and 3 young unmarried Smiths lived in the house, and each of these had his own place at table. Miss Lane, in a higher chair than the others, known as a carving chair, sat enthroned at the head of the table. Then, on the side facing the windows, came Laura and Matthew, the foreman, with a long space of tablecloth between them, supposed to be reserved for visitors. Laura's seeming place of honour had no doubt been allotted to her for handiness in passing cups and plates. The young Smiths sat 3 abreast at the bottom end of the table, and Zillah the maid had a small side table of her own. All meals excepting tea were taken in this order. Cooking and washing up were done in the back kitchen. The front kitchen was the family living and dining room. In the fireplace, a small sitting-room grate with hobs had replaced the fire on the hearth of a few years before, but the open chimney and chimney corners had been left, and from one of these, a long, high-backed settle ran out into the room. In the space thus enclosed, a red and black carpet had been laid to accommodate Miss Lane's chair at the head of the table and a few fireside chairs. This little room within a room was known as the hearth place. Beyond it, the stone floor was bare, but for a few mats. Brass candlesticks and a brass pestle and mortar ornamented the high mantelshelf, and there were brass warming pans on the walls, together with a few coloured prints. One of the first man in this country to carry an umbrella. Rain was coming down in sheets, and he was followed by a jeering but highly ornamental crowd. A blue and white dish of oranges stuck with cloves stood upon the dresser. They were dry and withered at that time of the year, but still contributed their quota to the distinctive flavour of the air. Everything there was just as Miss Lane had inherited it, except for a couple of easy chairs by the hearth. She had added nothing. "What was good enough for my parents and grandparents is good enough for me," she would say when some of her more fashionable friends tried to persuade her to bring her house up to date. But family loyalty was rather an excuse than a reason for her preference. She kept the old things she had inherited because she enjoyed seeing and owning them. That afternoon, when Laura arrived, a little round table in the hearth place had already been laid for tea. And what a meal! There were boiled new-laid eggs, and scones and honey and homemade jam, and, to crown all, a dish of fresh Banbury cakes. The carrier had a standing order to bring her a dozen of those cakes every market day. It seemed a pity to Laura that the first time she had been offered 2 eggs at one meal, she could barely eat one, and that the Banbury cake, hitherto to her a delicious rarity only seen in her home when purchased by visiting aunts, should flake and crumble almost untasted upon her plate because she felt too excited and anxious to eat. But Miss Lane ate enough for the 2 of them. Food was her one weakness. She loaded her scone, already spread with fresh farm butter, with blackcurrant jam, and topped it with cream, while she inquired about the health of Laura's mother and told Laura what her new duties would be. Once or twice during tea, the post office doorbell tinkled, and she wiped her mouth and sailed majestically off to sell stamps. But the hour of her early tea was the quietest hour of the day. After that, what she called her rush hour began, and for that, Laura was allowed to accompany her. With what expert speed Miss Lane stamped letters and made up the mail, and with what ceremonious courtesy she answered questions which sounded like conundrums to Laura, was a wonder to hear and see. The doorbell tinkled all the time as people came in to collect their afternoon mail. There was a delivery of letters in the morning, and the poorer inhabitants of the place only called in the afternoon when they were expecting a letter. "I suppose there isn't nothing for me, Miss Lane?" they would say, almost apologetically, and would look pleased or disappointed according to her reply. Those of more assured position called regularly, and these often would not speak at all, but put their heads inside the door and raise their eyebrows inquiringly. None of them gave their names or addresses, because Miss Lane knew everybody on and around the green, and she seldom had to look in the pigeonholes labelled A to Z, because she had sorted the letters and could answer from memory. She often knew from whom the letter was expected and what its contents were likely to be, and would console the disappointed callers with, "Better luck in the morning, there's barely time for an answer as yet." Out in the kitchen, Zillah and the workmen were at tea. The rattle of their teacups and the subdued hum of their conversation could be heard in the office. This was the only meal of the day at which Miss Lane herself did not preside. Zillah poured out, but she did not occupy her mistress's seat at the head of the table. That was sacred. Between each pouring out, she retired to her own seat on the settle with her own little table before her. At the other, more formal meals, the conversation was carried on by Miss Lane and her foreman, with an occasional reference to Zillah when any item of local interest was under discussion, while the young Smiths at the foot of the table munched in silence. At tea, with the mistress engaged elsewhere, there was more freedom, and sometimes Zillah's shrill laughter would break through a chorus of guffaws from the younger workmen. In moderation, this was tolerated. But one day, when someone rapped loudly upon the table with a teacup and said, Miss Lane said, shouted, "Another pint, please, landlady," the office door opened, and a voice as severe as that of a schoolmistress admonishing her class called for, "Less noise there, please." None of them resented being spoken to like children, nor did the young journeyman resent being placed below the salt, nor Zillah at her separate table. To them, these things were all part of an established order. To that unawakened generation, freedom was of less account than good food, and of that, in that household, there was an abundance. Tea was not considered a substantial meal. It was for the workmen, as Miss Lane counted time, an innovation. She could remember when bread and cheese and beer were at that hour taken to the forge for the men to consume standing. "Afternoon baver," they had called it. Now a well-covered table awaited them indoors. Each man's plate was stacked with slices of bread and butter, and what was called a relish was provided. "What can we give the men for a relish at tea time?" was an almost daily question in that household. Sometimes a blue and white basin of boiled new-laid eggs would be placed on the table. 3 eggs per man was the standard allowance, but 2 or 3 extra were usually cooked in case. And at the end of the meal, the basin was always empty. On other afternoons, there would be brawn, known locally as collared head or soused herrings, or a pork pie or cold sausages. As the clock struck 5, The scraping of iron-tipped boots would be heard, and the men, with leather aprons wound up around their waists, and their faces still moist from their visit to the pump in the yard, looking preternaturally clean against their work-soiled clothes, would troop into the kitchen. While they ate, they would talk of the horses they had been shoeing. "That new grey of Squire's was near as damn it to nipping my ear. A groom ought to stand by and hold the young devil." Or, "Poor old Whitefoot, about time he were pensioned off. Went to sleep and nearly fell down top of me today, he did. Let's see, how old is he now, do you reckon?" 20, if he's a day. Ms. Elliot's father used to ride him to hounds, and he's been dead this 10 years. But you leave old Whitefoot alone. He'll drag that station cart for another 5 years. What's he got to cart? Only young Jim, and he's a 7-stunner, if that. Maybe a bit of fish and a parcel or two. You take my word for it. Old Whitefoot ain't going to die while he can see anybody else alive." Or they would talk about the weather, or the crops, or some new arrival in the place, extracting the last grain of interest from every trifling event, while separated from them by only a closed door, the new activities of a more sophisticated day were beginning. On her first day in the office, Laura stood awkwardly by Miss Lane, longing to show her willingness to help, but not knowing how to begin. Once, when there was a brisk demand for penny stamps, and the telegraph bell was ringing, she tried timidly to sell one, but she was pushed gently aside, and afterwards it was explained to her that she must not so much as handle a letter or sell a stamp until she had been through some mysterious initiation ceremony which Miss Lane called being sworn in. This had to take place before a justice of the peace, and it had been arranged that she should go the next morning to one of the great houses in the locality for that purpose. And she would have to go alone, for until she herself had qualified, Miss Lane could not leave home during office hours, and she feared she would not know which doorbell to ring or what to say when she came into the great man's presence. Oh dear, this new life seemed very complicated. The dread of this interview haunted her, until at Miss Lane's suggestion she went out for a turn in the garden, where she was told she might always go for a breath of fresh air between busy times in the office. She had been in that garden before, but never in May, with the apple blossom out and the wallflowers filling the air with their fragrance. Narrow paths between high, built-up banks supporting flower borders, crowded with jonquils, auriculas, forget-me-nots, and other spring flowers, led from one part of the garden to another. One winding path led to the earth closet in its bower of nut trees halfway down the garden, another to the vegetable garden, and on to the rough grass plot before the beehives. Between each section were thick groves of bushes with ferns and capers and Solomon's seal, so closed in that the long rough grass there was always damp. Wasted ground, a good gardener might have said, but delightful in its cool green shadiness. Nearer the house was a portion given up entirely to flowers, not growing in beds or borders, but crammed together in an irregular square where they bloomed in half-wild profusion. There were rose bushes there, and lavender and rosemary, and a bush apple tree which bore little red and yellow streaked apples in late summer, and Michaelmas daisies and red-hot pokers, and old-fashioned pom-pom dahlias in autumn, and peonies and pinks already budding. An old man in the village came one day a week to till the vegetable garden, but the flower garden was no one's especial business. Miss Lane herself would occasionally pull on a pair of wash-leather gloves and transplant a few seedlings. Matthew would pull up a weed or stake a plant as he passed, and the Smiths, once a year, turned out of the shop to dig between the roots and cut down dead canes. Between whiles, the flowers grew just as they would in crowded masses, perfect in their imperfection. Laura, who came from a district often short of water, was amazed to find no less than 3 wells in the garden. There was the well beneath the pump near the back door, which supplied the house with water, a middle well outside the inner smithy door, used only for trade purposes, and what was called the bottom well near the beehives. The bottom well was kept padlocked. Moss grew on its lid and nettles around it. At one time it had supplied the house with drinking water, but that was a long time ago. Everyone in any way connected with the place knew the story of the wells. No one had suspected the existence of the one near the house until one day, while Miss Lane was still a small child, a visitor who had come to tea was on her way to what was still known as the little house halfway down the garden. When she had gone a few yards from the back door, a flagstone on the path gave way beneath her feet, and she found herself slipping into a chasm. Fortunately, she was a substantially built woman, and by flinging out her arms, she was able to support her upper part above ground while her legs dangled in space. Her screams soon brought assistance, and she was hauled to safety, and the modern treatment of bed and hot water bottles for shock being as yet undiscovered, Miss Lane's mother did what she could by lacing the patient's tea with rum, which remedy acted so well that when passing her cup a third time, she actually giggled and said, "This tastes a lot better than that old well water would have done." When or why the well had been abandoned and not properly filled in, no one ever knew. Miss Lane's grandparents had had no knowledge of it, and they had come to live there early in the century, and both they and her parents and herself as a child had walked gaily over it thousands of times, little suspecting the danger that lurked below. However, all ended well. After the well had been thoroughly cleansed and the water tested, it provided an excellent supply close at hand for the house. When Laura went to bed that night in her new little bedroom, with its pink washed walls, faded chintz curtains, and chest of drawers all for her own use, she was too tired to write more in her new journal than, "Came to live at Candleford Green today, Monday." After she was in bed, she heard Zilla call the cat, then plod flat-footed upstairs. Then the men came up, pad-padding in their stockinged feet, and last of all, Miss Lane tap-tapping on her high heels. Laura sat up in bed and drew aside the window curtain. Not a light to be seen. Only darkness, thick and moist, and charged with the scent of damp grass and cottage garden flowers. All was silent, except for the sharp, sudden swish of a breeze in the smithy tree, and so it would be all night, unless the hoof sounds of a galloping horse rang out, followed by the pealing of the doctor's bell. There was no ordinary night traffic on country roads in those days. Chapter 2. On Her Majesty's Service. The interview next morning did not turn out so terrifying as Laura had expected. Sir Timothy smiled very kindly upon her when the footman ushered her into his justice room, saying, "The young person from the post office, please, Sir Timothy." "What have you been up to? Poaching, rick-burning, or petty larceny?" he asked when the footman had gone. "If you're as innocent as you look, I shan't give you a long sentence, so come along." And he drew her by the elbow to the side of his chair. Laura smiled dutifully, for she knew by the twinkle of his keen blue eyes beneath their shaggy white eyebrows that Sir Timothy was joking. As she leaned forward to take up a pen with which to sign the thick blue official document he was unfolding, she sensed the atmosphere of jollity, good sense, and good nature, together with the smell of tobacco, stables, and country tweeds he carried around like an aura. "But read it, read!" he cried in a shocked voice. "Never put your name to anything before you have read it, or you'll be signing your own death warrant one of these days." And Laura read out, as clearly as her shyness permitted, the declaration which even the most humble candidate for Her Majesty's service had in those serious days to sign before a magistrate. "I do solemnly promise and declare that I will not open or delay or cause or suffer to be opened or delayed any letter or anything sent by the post," it began, and went on to promise secrecy in all things. When she had read it through, she signed her name. Sir Timothy signed his, then folded the document neatly for her to carry back to Miss Lane, who would send it on to the higher authorities. Sir Timothy could not have been very busy that morning, for he kept her talking a long time, asking her age and where she came from, and how many brothers and sisters she had, and what she had learnt at school, and if she thought she would like the post office business. "You've been well brought up," he said at last, as weightily as if pronouncing sentence in court. "And you shall do well. Miss Lane is an excellent woman, most efficient and kind, too, to those of whom she approves, though I should not like to offend her myself. By gad, I should not. I remember one day when she was a girl. But perhaps I had better not tell you that story. Now, I expect you would be glad of some refreshment. Ask Purchase or Robert to show you the way to the housekeeper's room. There's sure to be tea or coffee or something going there at this time. And Laura dropped a little curtsy as she said, "No, thank you, Sir Timothy, no, thank you," and passed through the door, which he courteously held open, and down the long resounding stone passage which led to the side door, and was very glad that she saw no one. For when she arrived, the footman had teasingly pulled her hair and asked for a kiss. Out in the park, she turned and looked back at the long, white, battlemented facade of the mansion, with its terraces, fountains and flower beds, and thought, "Thank goodness that's over. I don't suppose I shall ever see this place again." But she erred in her supposition. She was to cross the park, come clanging through the iron swing gate, and pass beneath the tall, rook-noisy elms to the mansion every morning in all weathers for nearly 3 years. For the first few days, Laura feared she would never learn her new duties. Even in that small country post office, there was in use what seemed to her a bewildering number and variety of official forms, to all of which Miss Lane, who loved to make a mystery of her work, referred by number, not name. But soon, in actual practice, AB 35, K21, XY 13, or what not, became the Blue Savings Bank form, the postal order abstract, the cash account sheet, and so on, and Laura found herself flicking them out of their pigeonholes and carrying them without a moment's hesitation to where Miss Lane sat doing her accounts at the kitchen table. Then the stamps. The penny and halfpenny ones she already knew by sight were in 10-shilling and 5-shilling sheets, which hot, nervous hands were inclined to tear, and those of higher value, neatly hinged in a cardboard-leafed book, ready to be sold for parcels and telegrams, had to be detached just so, working up from the left-hand bottom corner. And the cash drawer, with its 3 wooden bowls for gold, silver and copper, and all 3 bowls at least half full, even the one for sovereigns and half-sovereigns, what a lot of money there must be in the world. Laura would run her fingers through the shining gold coins when the cash was counted at night and placed in the black japanned box ready to be taken upstairs, wrapped in an old woolly shawl as disguise, and stood on the top shelf of Miss Lane's clothes cupboard. Occasionally there was a banknote in the japanned box, but no treasury notes, for there were none issued. There was plenty of gold to serve as currency in those days. Gold in plenty flowed through the country in a stream, but a stream to which only the fortunate had access. 1 poor half-sovereign was doled out on Saturday night to the lowest-paid workers. Men who had a trade might get a whole sovereign and a few pieces of silver. At first, when giving change, Laura boggled and hesitated and counted again, but although she had learned little arithmetic at school, she was naturally quick at figures, and that part of her work soon became easy to her. And she liked seeing and speaking and being spoken to by the post office customers, especially the poorer ones, who would tell her about their affairs and sometimes ask her advice. The more important at first would ignore her if Miss Lane was present, or if she was absent, would ask to see her. But they soon got used to seeing a new face there, and once, when Laura had gone indoors to tea, a gentleman farmer from a neighbouring hamlet actually inquired what had become of "that charming young gal you've got now." That set the seal of acceptance upon her, and fortunately, it was the only compliment so definitely expressed. Further inquiries of the kind might not have pleased Miss Lane. She liked Laura, and was glad to find she was giving satisfaction, but naturally expected to stand first in her customers' regards. Working hours in such small post offices as that where Laura was employed were then from the arrival of the 7 o'clock morning mail till the office was closed at night, with no weekly half-day off, and Sunday not entirely free, for there was a Sunday morning delivery of letters and an outward mail to be made up in the evening. Slaves' hours, she was told by those employed directly by government in the larger post offices, where they worked an 8-hour day. And so they would have been, had life moved at its present-day pace. At that time, life moved in a more leisurely manner. The amount of business transacted in such village post offices was smaller and its nature more simple. There were no complicated forms with instructions for filling in to be dealt out to the public, no government allowances to be paid, and the only pensions were the quarterly ones to ex-servicemen, of whom there would not be more than 3 or 4 in such a place. During the day there were long, quiet intervals in which meals could be taken in comparative peace, or reading or knitting were possible, while where 2 were engaged in the business, as at Candleford Green, there were opportunities of getting out into the fresh air. Most important of all, there was leisure for human contacts. Instead of rushing in a crowd to post at the last moment, villagers would stroll over the green in the afternoon to post their letters and stay for a chat, often bringing an apple or a pear or a nosegay from their gardens for Laura. There was always at least 1 pot of cut flowers in the office. Pink moss roses, sweet williams, and lad's love in summer, and in autumn, the old-fashioned yellow and bronze button chrysanthemums, which filled cottage gardens at that time. In time, Laura came to know these regular customers well. Some letter or telegram they had received or were sending opened the way to confidences, and often afterwards she was treated as an old friend and would ask if the daughter in Birmingham had made a good recovery from her confinement, or if the son in Australia was having better luck, or how the wife's asthma was, or if the husband had succeeded in getting the job he was trying for. And they would ask Laura if her people at home were well, or compliment her upon a new cotton frock she was wearing, or ask her if she liked such and such a flower, because they had some at home they could bring her. The morning mail arrived from the head office by walking postman at 7 o'clock, and it was Laura's first duty of the day to attend to the opening of the mailbag and the distribution of its contents in what had in times past been one of the numerous outbuildings of the house: wash-house, brew-house, or pantry. New floored and new ceiled, and with sorting benches placed around, it made a convenient little sorting office. Although, with no other means of heating than an oil stove, it was cold there in winter. Every morning the postman who had brought the mail remained to sort out his own letters for the village delivery, and the 2 women letter carriers who did cross-country deliveries to outlying houses and farms had their own sorting. The elder woman, Mrs. Gubbins, was an old countrywoman who wore for her round a lilac sunbonnet with apron and shawl. She was a crabbed old creature who seldom spoke beyond grunting a good morning, except when some local scandal was afoot, when she could be voluble enough. The other postwoman was still in her 30s, and as pleasant in manner as Mrs. Gubbins was uncouth. Her name was Mrs. Macy, and more will be told about her later. The morning postman, Thomas Brown, was a stockily built man with greying hair who had, as far as was known, always led a quiet, respectable life. Until recently, he had taken great interest in local affairs and had had such good judgment that he had occasionally been asked to arbitrate in local disputes. A teetotaler and a non-smoker, his only known vice had been an addiction to grumbling, especially about the weather, which he seemed convinced was ordered by someone with a special grudge against postmen. Then, just before Laura knew him, he had been converted at a chapel revivalist meeting, and the people who had formerly lain in wait for him on his round to ask his advice about their worldly affairs — what, for instance, could they ask from the MFH for those 3 hens that old fox had carried off in the night, or for the cabbage patch the hunt had trampled — now almost ran in the opposite direction when they saw him coming, lest he should ask impertinent questions about their souls. "How is it with your soul?" he would unblushingly inquire of any chance-met acquaintance. Or more directly, "Have you found salvation?" And in face of a question like that, what could a man or woman do but mumble and look silly? All but Miss Lane, who suddenly asked in an earnest tone, "Miss Lane, are you a Christian?" replied haughtily, "I do not see that whether I am or not is any business of yours, but if you particularly want to know, I am a Christian in the sense that I live in a Christian country and try to order my life according to Christian teaching. Dogma I leave to those better qualified than myself to expound, and I advise you to do the same." That last was a shrewd thrust, because he had recently become a local preacher. But he did not feel it as such, for he only shook his grey head and said mournfully, "Ah, I see you've not found Christ yet." Laura was pleased when she heard that his wife had been converted, for outside his home he found little sympathy. His position seemed to her quite clear. He had found, as he thought, a priceless treasure which all mankind might share if they would, and he wanted to make it known to them. The pity was that he himself was so poor an advertisement of the change of heart he wished them to experience. His expression and voice when he spoke of divine love failed to light up or to soften, and although he now declared that he had been the chief of sinners, his outward life had always been so exemplary that there could be no sudden change there to illustrate and enforce his new faith. Moreover, he was still grumbling and censorious. But at least he had the courage of his convictions. Laura discovered that in him once when one of the higher officials was paying the office a visit of inspection. He was a very great man officially, and had arrived wearing a top hat and in immaculate morning suit in the station fly. When the office had been surveyed, and a few criticisms made, none of them very severe, because the business was really well run and the delicious tea which followed the survey had softened the edges before they were delivered, he announced that he had to see Postman Brown, then about due with a letterbox collection. Laura, quietly sorting the night mail, could not help hearing what was said at this interview. "About this new Sunday evening collection now," began the surveyor in his high-pitched public schoolboyish accent. "I hear you object to doing it." Postman, subdued but not intimidated. "Yes, sir, I do object." Surveyor. "On what grounds, may I ask? Your colleagues have agreed, and there is extra pay for it. It is your place, my man, to carry out the duties laid down for you by the department, and I advise you, for your own good, to withdraw your objection immediately." Postman, firmly. "I can't, sir." Surveyor. "But why, man, why? What do you usually do on a Sunday evening? Got another job? Because, if so, I warn you that to undertake outside employment of any kind is against the regulations." Postman, manfully and with spirit. "My job on Sunday evenings, sir, is to worship my Creator, who himself laid down the law. Keep holy the Sabbath day. And I can't go against that, sir." By that time the man was trembling. He knew that his post and the pension he had so nearly earned hung in the balance. He drew out a big red white-spotted handkerchief and mopped his forehead. Yet there was still a certain dignity about him, far removed from his ordinary demeanour. The gentleman appeared to less advantage. His easy, urbane, authoritative manner dropped from him, and there was an ugly sneer in the way he pronounced the words. "Takes a lot out of you, I suppose, this worshipping business. Better attend to the work which provides you with bread and butter. But you can go now. I will report what you have said, and you will hear further about it." Then, to Laura, as Brown went out with a humble, "Good night, sir." "A cantankerous man, I know his kind, out to make trouble. But he will find he will have to fit in the Sunday evening work with his psalm singing." But although highly placed, it appeared that Mr. Cochrane was not all-powerful. Someone at headquarters was more sympathetically disposed to Sabbatarian principles, or perhaps the head postmaster, who was a bit of a psalm singer himself, interceded for Brown. For after a few weeks of suspense, he was excused Sunday evening attendance. The other postmen did his collection with pleasure, for it brought them in a little extra pay, and he continued to add to his already high weekly walking mileage by tramping the countryside to preach in little local chapels. Twice a year, the head postmaster from Candleford came to audit the accounts and made a general survey of the office. This was officially supposed to be a surprise visit, with the object of detecting any shortage of cash or neglect of duty. But Mr. Rushton and Miss Lane were on such terms that on the morning of the day of his intended visitation, The head postmaster would himself come to the telegraph instrument and with his own hands signal to Laura, "Please tell Miss Lane I shall be paying her a surprise visit this afternoon." That saved trouble all round. By the time Mr. Rushton's pony carriage drew up at the post office door, the account books, sheets of stamps, postal orders, licences, and so on, together with the cash, ready counted in neat piles, would be arranged in readiness on the kitchen table. So the official business did not take long, and that dispatched, the occasion became a social one. Tea was laid on the round table in the parlour for Mr. Rushton's visits, with Miss Lane in her best silk and a long gold chain twice round her neck and tucked into her waistband, pouring out tea from the best silver teapot. Mr. Rushton, doing full justice to the country fare, there was once cold duck on the table, and Laura bobbing in and out between her calls to the post office counter. The first time she was trusted to warm the pot and put in the tea from the special caddy for this function, she forgot to put in the tea and nearly dropped on the floor with nervous terror when the other two stared blankly at the crystal stream proceeding from the teapot. After tea, the garden and chickens and pigs had to be surveyed, and the pony cart loaded up with country produce, including a huge old-fashioned bouquet of flowers for Mrs. Rushton. It was an old-fashioned way of conducting business, and Mr. Rushton was an old-fashioned postmaster. He was a neat, middle-aged little man, very precise in his speech and manner, and with what many considered an exaggerated sense of his own importance. Pleasant, if somewhat patronising, to well-doers on his staff, but a terror to the careless and slipshod worker. He was under the impression that his own office staff adored him. "The crew of my little ship," he would say when speaking of those under him. "The crew of my little ship know who is captain." It is sad to have to record that the crew in private spoke of their captain as Holy Joe. That was because in private life Mr. Rushton was a pillar of the Methodist connection in Candleford town. Sunday school superintendent, occasional preacher, and the ready host of visiting ministers, a great man locally in his church, which perhaps accounted for his style of dress. In his black or very dark grey clothes and round black soft felt hat, driving his fat grey pony in the lanes, he might himself have been taken for a minister or even for a clergyman of the established church. On his salary of at most $250 a year, he was able in those spacious days to keep his own pony carriage, a maid for his wife, and to entertain his friends and educate his children. He was liked by the Candleford townspeople, but with those in the big country houses he was not a favourite. They thought him a too pedantic stickler for official rules. "That little jack in office," one of the squires called him. And there was a story of a fox-hunting baronet who had terminated an interview in the office marked postmaster by hurling a stone bottle of ink at the official head. It missed its mark, fortunately, but some of the younger clerks in his office still took a pride in pointing out the faint remaining traces of the splashes on the wallpaper. At an early stage of their acquaintance, Mr. Rushton promised Laura the offer of the next vacancy for a learner in his office. But the vacancy never occurred. His only two women clerks were the daughters of a minister, a friend of his own, and boarded with his family. They were quiet, refined, pleasant young women in their early 30s, of a type to which most women clerks in the post office at that time belonged. The young ladies with the artificial pearls and bad manners belonged to the early years of this century and disappeared before the last war. In Laura's time, post office employment was largely the preserve of ministers' and schoolmasters' daughters. It had not become popularised. The pay of a learner in the larger offices was very small, not nearly sufficient to live upon away from home, and the smaller offices, where learners were boarded, demanded a premium. Laura had crept in by a kind of back door, and later she was sometimes reminded of that fact. "Why should I teach you? My parents paid for me to learn," was a spirit not unknown in the service. For some time, Laura hoped one of the Miss Rapleys would marry, but neither of them showed the least disposition to oblige her in that manner, and gradually her hopes of a Candleford vacancy faded, and no other offered which it was possible for her to accept. This is no success story. She remained what was officially known as an assistant throughout her brief official career. But there were compensations, which might not have appealed to everybody, but appealed to her. The telegraph instrument had been installed in the parlour, where its scientific-looking white dials and brass trimmings looked strikingly modern against Miss Lane's old rosewood and mahogany furniture. It was what was known as the ABC type of instrument, now long superseded, even in such small offices, by the telephone. But it served very well in its day, being easy to learn and reliable in working. Larger and busier offices had sounder and single needle instruments, worked by the Morse code and read by sound. The ABC was read by sight. A handle, like that of a coffee mill, guided a pointer from letter to letter on a dial which had the alphabet printed around it, clockwise, and this came out and was read on a smaller dial at the other end of the circuit. Surrounding the operating dial were brass studs or keys, one for each letter, and the operator, turning the handle with one hand, depressed the keys with the finger of the other, and by so doing spelt out the words of a telegram. A smaller dial above, known as the receiver, recorded incoming messages. For a few days, Laura, with the book propped open before her to supply the words, practised sending. Round and round went the handle, and blick, blick, blick went the keys, slowly and jerkily at first, then more smoothly and quickly. Sometimes a bell attached to the instrument would ring, and a real telegram come through, which Miss Lane would take off while Laura tried hard to follow the pointer on the smaller upper dial. It whirled round so madly that she feared her eyes would never be able to follow it. But gradually they became accustomed to note its brief pauses, and in about a week she was able to take charge of the simple apparatus. How to get the telegrams delivered promptly was one of Miss Lane's problems. A girl named Minnie, who lived in one of the cottages near, could usually be depended upon to do this if she happened to be at home. But although there were only about a dozen incoming telegrams a day on the average, they were apt to come in rushes, with long intervals between, and often Minnie had barely had time to get out of hailing distance before another telegram arrived. Then there was running to and fro to find another messenger, or Zilla or the apprentice from the blacksmith's shop would be pressed into the service. Neither of these went willingly, and often they could ill be spared from their work, but it was a strict rule of the establishment that no telegram must be delayed. Another worrying thing about the delivery of telegrams was that even when two came fairly close together, they were bound to be for addresses in opposite directions. Many were for farms or for country houses 2 or even 3 miles distant, and Minnie trailed many miles about the countryside in a day. Trailing is the only way to describe her method of progress, for she had an apparently slow, languid walk, which was, in fact, deceptive, as she managed to cover long distances and usually be back in time. She was a pretty, doll-faced country girl of 15, with wide, rather vacant-looking blue eyes and a great love of finery. She usually appeared at the office in a very clean, if sometimes old, print frock and a flower-wreathed hat. One very hot day in a very hot summer, Miss Lane brought forth from her hoard an old white silk parasol with a deep cream lace frill and presented it to Minnie. Her face, as she went off beneath it to deliver her telegram, wore an expression Laura never forgot. It was one of utter felicity. End of CD 1. CD 2. Miss Lane's parlour door opened out into the public portion of the office, and it sometimes happened that after attending to the telegraph instrument, Laura found herself cut off from the inner side of the counter by what appeared to be a private and confidential conversation between Miss Lane and a customer. Then she would close the door softly and go straight to the bookcase. A few books, such as Cooking and Household Management, The Complete Farrier, and Dr. Johnson's Dictionary were kept on one of the kitchen window seats, but all the best books were kept behind glass doors above the bureau in the parlour. When one of these was lent to Laura, it had first to be fitted with a brown paper jacket, for Miss Lane was very particular about her books, most of which had belonged to her father. The collection was an unusual one to be found in a tradesman's parlour at that time, but her father had been an unusual man, a lover of poetry, especially of Shakespeare, and a student of history and astronomy. There were the works of William Shakespeare in 2 large flat volumes, and Hume's History of England in at least a dozen small fat ones. Scott's poetical works and a number of the Waverley novels, Cowper's poems and Campbell's and Gray's, Thomson's Seasons, and many other such books. Any of these she was told she might borrow, with one exception. That was Byron's Don Juan, a terrible book, she was told, and most unfit for her reading. "I don't know why I haven't destroyed it long ago," said Miss Lane. "Next time there's a bonfire in the garden, I must see about it." Laura knew she ought to be, and was, ashamed of herself when, at every opportunity, she stood before the bookcase with goggling eyes and many a guilty glance at the door, devouring another half-canto of Don Juan. She slipped the book into her pocket one night and took it to read in bed, and narrowly escaped detection when Miss Lane came suddenly into her room to give some instruction about the next morning's mail. She saved herself by tucking the book down into the bed beside her, but the feel of its sharp edges against her side made her so incoherent that Miss Lane glanced round suspiciously. "No reading in bed now," she said. "You've got no need to wear out your eyesight, and I'm sure I don't fancy being burnt to death in my sleep." And Laura replied in a small, meek voice, "No, Miss Lane." But she went on reading. She could not help it. How fascinating the book was! She felt she simply had to know what came next, and the blue skies and seas of those foreign shores, and the seaside caves and golden sands, and the wit of the author, and the felicity of his language and the dexterity of his rhymes enchanted her. She was shocked by some of the hero's adventures, but more often thrilled. Laura learned quite a lot by reading Don Juan. When she had finished eating that forbidden fruit, she turned to Shakespeare. Miss Lane said Shakespeare was the greatest poet who ever lived, and vowed that when she had time, she would reread every one of the plays herself. But she never did. She had read them all at some time, probably to please her father, and still remembered the stories and a few lines here and there of the poetry. Sometimes, when she was in a good mood, Laura would begin, "Good morrow, father," and she would reply, "Benedicite, what early tongue so sweet saluteth me?" and go on being the friar to Laura's Romeo. But much more often, in their off-duty hours, she was deep in The Origin of Species, or one of the books on human psychology she had bought at a doctor's sale of furniture. Such books as those and the leading articles in the Times were the kind of reading she liked. But because of her father, she could understand Laura's love of quite other literature. When Laura had read most of the parlour books, Miss Lane suggested that, as she was fond of reading, she should take out a library ticket at the Mechanics' Institute in Candleford town. Laura took out the ticket, and within a year, she had read and laughed and cried over the works of Charles Dickens, read such of the Waverley novels as had not before come her way, and made the acquaintance of many other writers hitherto unknown to her. Barchester Towers and Pride and Prejudice gave her a taste for the work of Trollope and Jane Austen, which was to be a precious possession for life. The caretaker at the Institute acted as a librarian during the day. He was a one-legged man named Hussey, and his manner and qualifications bore no resemblance to those of librarians today. He seemed to bear a positive grudge against frequent borrowers. "Can't you make up your mind?" he would growl at some lingerer at the shelves. "Take the first one it comes to. It won't be no fuller o' lies than t'others." And if that admonition failed, he would bring his broom and sweep close around the borrower's feet, not sparing toes or heels. Laura sometimes wondered if his surname was inherited from some virago of a maternal ancestor. But there was no dearth of books. After she left home, Laura never suffered in that way. Modern writers who speak of the booklessness of the poor at that time must mean books as possessions. there were always books to borrow. Chapter 3. The Green. In Laura's time, Candleford Green was still a village, and in spite of its nearness to a small country town which was afterwards to annex it, the life lived there was still village life. And this, she soon discovered, was as distinct from that of a hamlet, such as that in which she had been bred, as the life of a country town was from that of a city. In the hamlet, there lived only one class of people. All did similar work, all were poor and all equal. The population of Candleford Green was more varied. It had a clergyman of its own, and doctor and independent gentlewomen who lived in superior cottages with stabling attached, and artisans and labourers who lived in smaller and poorer ones, though none so small and poor as those of the hamlet. Then there were shopkeepers, and the schoolmaster, and a master builder, and the villa people who lived on the new building estate outside the village, most of whom worked in Candleford town a couple of miles away. The village was a little world in itself. The hamlet was but a segment. In the large country houses around lived squires and baronets and lords who employed armies of indoor servants, gardeners and estate workers. The village was their village too. They attended its church, patronised its shops and had influence upon its affairs. Their ladies might be seen in mellow tweeds and squashed hats, going in and out of the shops in the morning, or bringing flowers with which to decorate the church for some festival, or popping into the village school to see that all was going on there as they thought it should be. In the afternoon, the same ladies in silks and satins and huge feather boas would pass through the village in their carriages, smiling and bowing to all they met, for it was part of their duty, as they conceived it, to know every inhabitant. Some of the older village women still curtsied in acknowledgement, but that pretty, old-fashioned, if somewhat servile custom was declining, and with the younger or more enlightened, or slightly higher socially, smiles and a jerk of the head by way of a bow had become the usual response. Every member of the community knew his or her place, and few wished to change it. The poor, of course, wished for higher wages, the shopkeepers for larger shops and quicker turnovers, and the rich may have wished for higher rank and more extensive estates, but few wished to overstep the boundaries of class. Those at the top had no reason to wish for change, and by others, the social order was so generally accepted that there was no sense of injustice. If the squire and his lady were charitable to the poor, affable to the tradesman, and generous when writing out a cheque for some local improvement, they were supposed to have justified the existence of their class. If the shopkeeper gave good value and weight and reasonable credit in hard times, and the skilled workman had served his apprenticeship and turned out good work, no one grudged them their profits or higher wages. As to the labouring class, that was the most conservative of all. "I know my place and I keep it," some man or woman would say, with a touch of pride in the voice. And if one of the younger and more spirited among them had ambition, those of their own family would often be the first to ridicule and discourage them. The edifice of society as it then stood, apparently sound but already undermined, had served its purpose in the past. It could not survive in a changing world where machines were already doing what had been men's work, and what had formerly been the luxuries of the few were becoming necessities of the many. But in its old age, it had some pleasant aspects, and not everything about it was despicable. Along one side of the large oblong stretch of green sward which gave the village its name ran the road into Candleford town, a pleasant 2 miles with its raised footpath and shady avenue of beech trees. Facing the road and the green on that side, shops and houses and garden walls were strung closely enough together to form a one-sided street. This was known as the best side of the green, and many who lived there complained of the post office having been established on the opposite, quieter side, so out of the way and ill-convenient. The post office side of the green was known as the dull side, but Miss Lane did not find it dull, for from the vantage point of her windows she had a good view of the more populous road and of all that was going on there. The quieter road had only the post office and the smithy and one tall old red-brick Georgian farmhouse, where, judging by its size and appearance, people of importance must once have lived, but where then only an old cowman and his wife occupied one corner. The windows of their rooms had white lace curtains and pot plants. The other windows stared blankly in long rows out on the green. Rumour said that on certain nights of the year, ghostly lights might be seen passing from window to window of the upper story, for the house was supposed to be haunted, as all unoccupied or partly occupied large houses were supposed to be at that date. But old cowman Jolliffe and his wife laughed at these stories and declared that they were too cosy in their own rooms on winter nights to go looking for ghosts in the attics. "Us knows when we be well off," John would say, "with 3 good rooms rent-free and milk and taties found. We ain't such fools as to go farting around for that which might frighten us away." Between these few buildings on the quiet side were rickyard and orchard and garden walls with lilacs, laburnums and fruit trees overhanging. This greenery, with the golden or dun thatch of the pointed-topped ricks and the sights and sounds of the farmyard and smithy, gave this side of the green a countrified air, which some of the more go-ahead spirits of the place resented. They said the land occupied by the gardens and orchards ought to be developed. There was room there for a new Baptist chapel and a row of good shops, and these would bring more trade to the place and encourage people to build more houses. But for a few more years, the dull side of the green was to remain as it was. The farmyard sounds of cock-crow and milking time and the tang-tang of the forge were to blend with the strains of gramophone music and the hooting of motor horns before the farmhouse was demolished and its stock driven farther afield, and the smithy gave place to an up-to-date motor garage with petrol pumps and advertisement hoardings. Except for the church and vicarage, which stood back among trees at one end of the green, with only the church tower showing, and roomy old inn, which had known coaching days and now, after a long eclipse, was beginning to call itself an hotel at the other, these 2 roads were almost all there was of the village. There were labourers' cottages out in the fields, and a group of these called Hungry End stood just outside the village at the farther end, and there was the new building estate on the Candleford road, but neither of these was included in the view from the post office. Between the 2 roads lay the green, with its daisies and dandelions, and grazing donkey, and playing children and old men sunning themselves on the 2 backless benches. Or, in rainy weather, deserted, but for a few straggling figures crossing from various angles with umbrellas and letters to post in their hands. The road past the shops was the favourite promenade and meeting place, but on a few occasions the green itself became the focus of attention. And the greatest of these was when, on the morning of the first Saturday in January, the hunt met there in front of the roomy old inn. Then riders in scarlet would rein in their mounts to reach down for a stirrup cup, and their ladies, in tight-fitting habits with long flowing skirts, would turn on their side saddles to wave their hunting crops to their friends, or gather in groups to gossip while their mounts backed and fidgeted. And the waving white sterns of the pack moved hither and thither in massed formation at the word of command of the huntsman, there known as the whipper-in. If one of the hounds strayed a yard, he would call it by name. "Hi, Minnie!" or Spot or Cowslip or Trumpeter, and the animal would look lovingly into his face as it turned in meek obedience, which always seemed wonderful to Laura, in view of the fact that within a few hours the same animal might be helping to tear a living fellow creature limb from limb. But few there thought of the fox, beyond hoping that the first covert would be successfully drawn and that the day's sport would be good. The whole neighbourhood turned out to see the meet. Both roadways were lined with little low basket-work pony carriages with elderly ladies in furs, governess cars with nurses and children, farm carts with forks stuck upright in loads of manure, and butchers' and grocers' carts and bakers' white-tilted vans, and donkey barrows in which red-faced, horse-shouting hawkers stood up for a better view. Matthew used to say that it was a funny thing that everybody's errand led them in that direction on meat morning. On the green itself, school teachers, curates, men in breeches and gaiters with ash sticks, men in ragged coats and mufflers, smartly dressed girls from Candleford town, and local women in white aprons with babies in their arms pressed forward to see all there was to be seen, while older children rushed hither and thither shouting, "Tally-ho! Tally-ho!" and only missed by a miracle being hit by the horses' hoofs. Every year, as soon as the meet had assembled, Matthew would hang up his leather apron, slip into his second-best coat, and say that he must just pop across the green for a moment. Squire or Sir Austin or Muster Ramsbottom of Pilvery had asked him to run his hand over his mare's fetlock. But the Smiths were to get on with their work. None of their gaping and gazing. They had seen hosses before, and them that rode on 'em, though to judge by some of their doings, you'd think they didn't know the near from the offside. As soon as he had disappeared, the Smiths left anvil and tools and forge and fire to take care of themselves, and hurried out to a little hillock a few yards from the smithy door, where they stood close packed with their fringed leather aprons flapping about their legs. No one was likely to have business at the post office counter that morning, but the telegraph instrument had to be attended to, and although that was furnished with a warning bell, which could be heard all over the house, both Miss Lane and Laura found it necessary to be in constant attendance. From the window near the instrument, the green, with its restive horses and swaying crowds, its splashes of scarlet coats and its white splash of hounds, could be viewed in comfort. Miss Lane could recognise at sight almost everyone there, and give little character sketches of many for Laura's benefit. That gentleman there on the tall grey was outrunning the constable. He had got through a fortune of so much in so many years, and was now in Queer Street. The very horse he sat upon did not belong to him. He had got it to try out, as she happened to know. Tom Biles, the vet, had told her only yesterday. And that lady there, with the floating veil, was a perfect madam. Just look at all those men around her. Did you ever now? And that pretty quiet little thing was a cousin of Sir Timothy's, and that fine handsome young fellow was only a farmer. "Poor young things," she said one day, when a man and a girl rider had, ostensibly to soothe the restlessness of their mounts, detached themselves from the main body of the hunt, and were riding at a walking pace backwards and forwards before the post office windows. "Poor young things, trying to get in a word together. Think they're alone, no doubt, and them with the eyes of all the field upon them. Ah, I thought so. Here comes her mother. It'll never do, my poor dears, it'll never do, with him a younger son without a penny to bless himself, as the saying goes." But Laura, as yet, had less sympathy with lovers. Her eyes were fixed on a girl of about her own age in a scarlet coat and a small black velvet jockey cap, whose pony was giving her trouble. A groom came up quickly and took its reins. Laura thought she would like to be dressed like that girl, and to ride to hounds across fields and over streams on that mild January morning. In imagination, she saw herself flying across a brook, her hair streaming and her gloved hands holding the reins in such a masterly fashion that other riders near called out, "Well done," as she had heard riders near her home call out when witnessing a feat of horsemanship. When the hunt moved off to draw the appointed cover, men and women and boys and girls would follow on foot as long as their breath lasted. 2 or 3 working men of the tougher kind would follow the hunt all day, pushing through thorn hedges and leaping or wading brooks, ostensibly on the chance of earning a sixpence or two for opening gates for the timid or pointing out directions to the lagging horsemen. But actually, for the fun of the sport, which they thought well worth the loss of a day's pay and a good dressing down by the missus when they got home torn and tired and hungry at night. In summer, what grass there was on the green was cut with the scythe by the man who owned the donkey which grazed there. It is doubtful if he had any legal right to the grass. But even if not, his gain in donkey fodder was well repaid to the community by the newly cut hay scent which seemed to hang about the village all the summer. One of Laura's most lasting impressions of Candleford Green was that of leaning out of her bedroom window one soft, dark summer night when the air was full of new-made hay and elderflower scents, It could not have been late in the evening, for a few dim lights still showed on the opposite side of the green, and some boy or youth on his way home was whistling Annie Laurie. Laura felt she could hang there forever, drinking in the soft, scented night air. One other scene she remembered at the time of year when it is still summer but the evenings are closing in. Then youths were on the green flying kites, on which they had contrived to fix lighted candle ends. The little lights floated and flickered like fireflies against the dusk of the sky and the darker treetops. It was a pretty sight, although perhaps the sport was a dangerous one, for one of the kites caught fire and came down as tinder. At that, some men, drinking their pints outside the inn door for coolness, rushed forward and put a stop to it. Madness, they called it. Stark staring madness, and asked the youths if they wanted to set the whole place on fire. But how innocent and peaceful compared with our present menace from the air. Those who did not care for the dull side of the green would point with pride to the march of progress on the opposite side. To the fine new plate glass window at the grocer's, the plaster of Paris model of a 3-tiered wedding cake which had recently appeared among the buns and scones at the baker's next door, and the fishmonger's, where, to tell the truth, after the morning orders for the big houses had gone out, the principal exhibits were boxes of bloaters. But how many villages had a fishmonger at all? And the corner shop, known as the stores, where the latest Candleford green fashions might be studied. Only the butcher lagged behind. His shop stood back in a garden, and the lambs and hares and legs of mutton behind its one small window were framed in roses and honeysuckle. Interspersing the shops were houses. One, a long, low brown one, where Dr. Henderson lived. His red lamp, when lighted at night, made a cheerful splash of colour. Less appreciated by those who lived near was the disturbing peal of his night bell, followed by some anxious voice bawling up to him through the speaking tube. Some of his night calls came from outlying hamlets and farms, 6, 8, or even 10 miles distant. And those from the poor had to be brought on foot, for bicycles were still rare, and the telephone was as yet unknown there. The doctor, dragged from his warm bed at midnight, had often to saddle or harness his own horse before he could start on his long ride or drive, for even if he kept a man to drive him around in the daytime, that man might not be available for night work. And yet, swear as he might, and often did, on the journey, damning horse, messenger, roads, and weather, the doctor brought cheer and skill and kindness to his patient's bedside. "She'll be all right now our doctor's come," the woman downstairs would say. "And he's that cheerful he's making her laugh between her pains. That's my 5th cup of tea, he says, if I have any more. But I'd better not say what he said'd happen. Only it made Maggie laugh, and she can't be so bad if she's laughing." And that was said of a man who, after a hard day's work, had been dragged from his bed to spend the night in a tiny, fireless bedroom, overseeing a difficult delivery. Laura's mother used to say, "All doctors are heroes." And she spoke feelingly, for the night before Laura was born, the doctor came from the nearest town through one of the worst snowstorms in then living memory. He had to leave his horse and gig at a farmhouse on the main road and walk the last mile, for the by-road to the hamlet was blocked to wheeled traffic by drifts. No wonder, he said when Laura at last put in an appearance, "There you are. Here is the person who has caused all this bother. Let us hope she will prove worth it." Which saying was kept as a rod in pickle to be repeated to Laura when she misbehaved during her childhood. From her post office window in summer, Laura could see the grey church tower with its flagstaff and the twisted red brick chimneys of the vicarage rising out of massed greenery. In winter, when the trees were bare, there were glimpses of the outer tracery of the east window of the church and the mellow brick front of the vicarage, with rooks tumbling and cawing above the high elm tops where they nested in early spring. At the time when Laura arrived at Candleford Green, a clergyman of the old type held the cure of souls of its inhabitants. He was an elderly man with what was then known as a fine presence, being tall and large rather than stout, with rosy cheeks, a lion-like mane of white hair, and an air of conscious authority. His wife was a dumpy little roly-poly of a woman who wore old, comfortable clothes about the village because, as she was once heard to say, "Everybody here knows who I am, so why bother about dress?" For church and for afternoon calls upon her equals, she dressed in the silks and satins and ostrich feathers befitting her rank as the granddaughter of an earl and the wife of a vicar with large private means. She was said by the villagers to be a bit managing, but on the whole she was popular with them. When visiting the cottages or making purchases at the shops, she loved to hear and discuss the latest titbit of gossip, which she was not above repeating, some said with additions. The church services were long, old-fashioned and dull, but all was done decently and in order, and the music and singing were exceptionally good for a village church at that date. Mr. Coulsdon preached to his poorer parishioners contentment with their divinely appointed lot in life and submission to the established order of earthly things. To the rich, the responsibilities of their position and their obligations in the way of charity. Being rich and highly placed in the little community, and genuinely loving a country life, he himself naturally saw nothing wrong in the social order, and being of a generous nature, the duty of helping the poor and afflicted was also a pleasure to him. In cold, hard winters, soup was made twice a week in the vicarage washing copper, and the cans of all comers were filled without question. It was soup that even the very poor, connoisseurs from long and varied experience of charity soups, could find no fault with. Rich and thick with pearl barley and lean beef gobbets and golden carrot rings and fat little dumplings, so solidly good that it was said that a spoon would stand in it upright. For the sick there were custard puddings, home-made jellies and half bottles of port, and it was an unwritten law in the parish that by sending a plate to the vicarage at precisely 1:30 on any Sunday, a convalescent could claim a dinner from the vicarage joint. There were blankets at Christmas, unbleached calico chemises for girls on first going out in service, flannel petticoats for old women, and flannel-lined waistcoats for old men. So it had been for a quarter of a century, and Mr. and Mrs. Coulsdon and their fat coachman Thomas and Hannah the parlour-maid, who doctored the villagers' lesser ailments with herb tea and ointments, and Gantry the cook and the spotted Dalmatian dog which ran behind Mrs. Coulsdon's carriage, and the heavy carved mahogany furniture and rich damask hangings of the vicarage seemed to the villagers almost as firmly established and enduring as the church tower. Then, one summer afternoon, Mrs. Coulsdon, dressed in her best, drove off in her carriage to attend a large and fashionable bazaar and sale of work got up by the country notabilities, and, in addition to her many purchases, brought back with her the germ which killed her within a week. Her husband caught the infection and followed her a few days later, and they were buried in one grave, to which their coffins were followed by the entire population of the parish, and sincerely mourned, for that one day at least, even by those who had scarcely given them a thought before. The Candleford News had a 3-column account of the funeral, headed, "The Candleford Green Tragedy, Funeral of Beloved Vicar and His Wife." And the grave and the surrounding sward, covered with wreaths and crosses and pathetic little bunches of cottage garden flowers, was photographed, and copies were sold at 4p each and framed and hung upon cottage walls. Then the parishioners began to wonder what the new vicar would be like. "We shall be lucky if we get another as good as Mr. Coulsdon," they said. "He was a gentleman, as was a gentleman, and she was a lady. Never interfered with anybody's business, he didn't, and was good to the poor. And dealt with the local shops, and paid on the nail," added the shopkeepers. Months later, after every room in the vicarage had been overhauled by workmen and the greater part of the garden and paddock had been torn up to get at the drains, which were naturally suspect, the new vicar arrived. But he and his family belonged so much to the new order of things that they must be given a later place in this record. It sometimes seems to us that some impression of those now dead must be left upon their familiar earthly surroundings. We saw them on such a day, in such a spot, in such an attitude, smiling or not smiling, and the impression of the scene is so deeply engraved upon our own hearts that we feel they must have left some more enduring trace, though invisible to mortal eyes. Or perhaps it would be better to say at present, invisible, for the discovery of sound waves has opened up endless possibilities. If any such impressions of good old Mr. Coulsdon remain, one may be of him as Laura once saw him, brought to a halt on one of his daily progresses round the green. He stood, well-fed and well-groomed, in a world that seemed made for him, gravely shaking his head at a distant view of the gambols of the village idiot, as if asking himself the frequent question of lesser mortals, why? Why? For Candleford Green had its village idiot in the form of a young man who had been born a deaf mute. At birth he was probably not mentally deficient, but he had been born too early to profit by the marvellous modern system of training such unfortunates, and had, as a child, been allowed to run wild while other children were in school, and the isolation and the absence of all means of communicating with his fellows had told upon him. At the time when Laura knew him, he was a full-grown man, powerfully built with a small golden beard his mother kept clipped, and in his quieter moments, an innocent rather than a vacant expression. His mother, who was a widow, took in washing, and he would fetch and carry her clothes baskets, draw water from the well, and turn the handle of the mangle. At home, the two of them used a rough language of signs which his mother had invented, but with the outside world he had no means of communication, and for that reason, coupled with that of his occasional fits of temper, although he was strong and probably capable of learning to do any simple manual work, no one would give him employment. He was known as Loony Joe. Joe spent his spare time, which was the greater part of each day, lounging about the green, watching the men at work at the forge or in the carpenter's shop. Sometimes, after watching quietly for some time, he would burst into loud, inarticulate cries which were taken for laughter, then turn and run quickly out into the country, where he had many lairs in the woods and hedgerows. Then the men would laugh and say, "Oh, Loony Joe's like the monkeys. They could talk if they'd a mind to, but they think if they did we'd set 'em to work." If he got in the way of the workmen, they would take him by the shoulders and run him outside, and it was chiefly his wild gestures, contortions of feature, and loud, inarticulate cries at such times which had earned him his name. "Loony Joe, Loony Joe," the children would call out after him, secure in the knowledge that whatever they said, he could not hear them. But although he was deaf and dumb, Joe was not blind, and once or twice, when he had happened to look round and see them following and mocking him, he had threatened them by shaking the ash stick he carried. The story of this lost nothing in the telling, and people were soon saying that Joe was getting dangerous and ought to be put away. But his mother fought stoutly for his liberty, and the doctor supported her. Joseph was sane enough, he said. His seeming strangeness came from his affliction. Those against him would do well to see that their own children were better behaved. What went on in Joe's mind nobody knew, though his mother, who loved him, may have had some idea. Laura many times saw him standing to gaze on the green with knitted brows, as though puzzling as to why other young men should be batting and bowling there and himself left out. Once some men unloading logs to add to Miss Lane's winter store allowed Joe to hand down from the cart some of the heaviest, and for a time his face wore an expression of perfect happiness. After a while, unfortunately, his spirits soared and he began flinging the logs down wildly and, as a result, hit one of the men on the shoulder and was turned away roughly. At that, he fell into one of his passions, and afterwards people said that Loony Joe was madder than ever. But he could be very gentle. Once Laura met him in a lonely spot between trees, and she felt afraid. For the path was narrow and she was alone. But she felt ashamed of her cowardice afterwards, for as she passed him, so closely that their elbows touched, the big fellow, gentle as a lamb, put out his hand and stroked some flowers she was carrying. With nods and smiles, Laura passed on, rather hurriedly, it must be confessed, but wishing more than ever she could do something to help him. Some years after Laura had left the district, she was told that after his mother's death, Loony Joe had been sent to the county asylum. Poor Joe. The world, which went very well for some people in those days, was a harsh one for the poor and afflicted. For the old and poor too. That was long before the day of the old age pension, and for many who had worked hard all their lives and had preserved their self-respect so far, the only refuge in old age was the workhouse. There old couples were separated, the men going to the men's side and the women to that of the women. And the effect of this separation on some faithful old hearts can be imagined. With the help of a few shillings a week, parish relief, and the still fewer shillings their children, mostly poor like themselves, could spare, some old couples contrived to keep their own roof over their heads. Laura knew several such couples well. The old man, bent nearly double upon his stick but clean and tidy, would appear at the post office periodically to cash some postal order for a tiny amount sent by a daughter in service or a married son. "Thank God we've got children," he would say, with pride as well as gratitude in his tone. And Laura would say, "Yes, isn't Katie or Jimmy splendid?" In those days, if anyone in a village was ill, it was the custom for neighbours to send them little dainties. Even Laura's mother, out of her poverty, would send a little of anything she thought a sick neighbour might fancy. Miss Lane, who had 10 times the resources of Laura's mother, did things in style. In cases of sickness, as soon as she heard the patient had turned the corner, she would kill or buy and have cooked a fowl in order to send a dinner. And Laura, being the quickest walker, was deputed to carry the covered plate across the green. It was an act of kindness which blessed giver and receiver alike, for the best cut from the breast of the bird was always reserved for Miss Lane's own dinner. But perhaps that was not a bad plan. Anticipation of the enjoyment of her own titbit may have acted as a stimulus to her good intention, and the invalids got the next best cuts, and broth was made from the bones for them later. Zillah could be trusted to cook the chicken, but once, when one of Miss Lane's own friends fell ill, she herself brought out from somewhere a cooking apron of fine white linen, and with her own hands made him a wine jelly. The history of that jelly was far removed from that of those we now buy in bottles from the grocer. To begin upon, calves' feet were procured and simmered for the better part of a day to extract the nourishment. Then the contents of the stewpan were strained, and the stock had another long boiling in order to render it down to the desired strength and quantity. Then more straining and sweetening and lacing with port, sufficient to colour it a deep ruby, and clearing with eggshells, and straining and straining. Then it was poured into a flannel jelly bag, the shape of a fool's cap, which had to hang from a hook in the larder ceiling all night to let its contents ooze through into the vessel placed beneath, without squeezing. And when at last all the complicated processes were completed, it was poured into a small mould and allowed yet one more night in which to set. No gelatine was used. What Miss Lane called a taster was reserved for herself in a teacup, and of this she gave Laura and Zillah a teaspoonful each that they might also taste. To Laura's untutored palate, it tasted no better than the red jujube sweets of which she was fond. But Zillah, out of her greater experience, declared that a jelly so strong and delicious would a'most raise the dead. Few would care to take that trouble for the sake of a few spoonfuls of jelly in these days. Laura's aunts delighted in such cookery, and her mother would have enjoyed doing it had her means permitted, but already it was thought a waste of time in many households. On the face of it, it does seem absurd to spend the inside of a week making a small jelly, and women were soon to have other uses for their time and energy. But those who did such cookery in those days looked upon it as an art, and no time or trouble was thought wasted if the result were perfection. We may call the Victorian woman ignorant, weak, clinging and vapourish. She is not here to answer such charges, but at least we must admit that she knew how to cook. Another cooking process Laura was never to see elsewhere, and which perhaps may have been peculiar to Smithy families, was known as salamandering. For this, thin slices of bacon or ham were spread out on a large plate and taken to the smithy, where the plate was placed on the anvil. The smith then heated red-hot one end of a large flat iron utensil known as the salamander and held it above the plate until the rashes were crisp and curled. Shelled, boiled or poached eggs were eaten with this dish. Bath nights at Candleford Green were conducted on the old country system. There was near the back door an old outbuilding formerly used as a brewhouse. Miss Lane could remember when all the beer for the house and the Smiths was brewed there. In Laura's time, it came from the brewery in 9-gallon casks. The custom of home brewing was fading out in farmers' and tradesmen's households. It saved trouble and expense to buy the beer from the brewery in barrels, but a few belonging to the older generation still brewed at home for themselves and their workmen. At the Candleford Green post office, Laura issued about half a dozen 4-shilling home brewing licences a year. One woman there kept an off-licence and brewed her own beer. There was a large old yew tree at the bottom of her garden, and her customers sat beneath its spreading branches on the green just outside her garden wall and consumed their drinks off the premises in compliance with the law. But as she brewed for sale, hers must have been a more expensive licence, probably issued by the magistrates. Miss Lane's brewhouse had become a bathhouse. It was not used by Miss Lane or by Zillah. Miss Lane took what she called her canary dip in a large, shallow, saucer-shaped bath in her bedroom, in a few inches of warm rainwater, well laced with eau de cologne. In winter she had a bedroom fire on her weekly bath night, and in all seasons the bath was protected by a screen, not, as might be supposed, to preserve Victorian modesty, but to keep off draughts. On the farm churning days, a quart of buttermilk was delivered for Miss Lane's toilet. That was for her face and hands. When, where and how Zillah bathed was a mystery. When baths in general were mentioned, she said she hoped she knew how to keep herself clean without boiling herself like a pig's cheek. As she always appeared very fresh and clean, Laura supposed she must have bathed by the old cottage method of washing all over in a basin. The Smiths, on account of the grubby black nature of their work, needed baths frequently, and for them, in the first place, the brewhouse had been turned into a bathroom. Wednesdays and Saturdays were their bath nights. Laura's was Friday. In one corner of the bathhouse stood the old brewing copper, now connected by a length of hosepipe passing through the window with the pump in the yard for filling purposes. A tap a few feet above floor level served to draw off the water when hot. On the brick floor stood the deep, man-length zinc bath used by the Smiths, and standing up-ended in a corner when not in use was the hip bath for Laura and for any visitor to the house who preferred, as they said, a good hot soak to sitting in a saucer. There was a square of matting rolled up, ready to be put down by the bather, and a curtain at the window, and another over the door to keep out prying eyes and cold air. To Laura, the brewhouse baths seemed luxurious. She had been used to bathing at home in the washhouse in water heated over the fire in a cauldron, but there, every drop of water had to be fetched from a well, and fuel being equally precious, the share of hot water for each person was small. A good scrub all over, and a rinse and make way for the next, were her mother's instructions. At Candleford Green, there was unlimited hot water, boiling water which filled the small building with steam, for the fire beneath it had been lighted by the smithy apprentice before he left work, and by 8 o'clock the water in the copper was bubbling. With curtains drawn over window and door, and red embers glowing beneath the copper, Laura would sit, with her knees drawn up, in hot water up to her neck, and luxuriate. She was often to think of those baths in later years when she stepped into or out of the few inches of tepid water in her clean but cold modern bathroom, or looked at the geyser, ticking the pennies away, and wondered if it would be too extravagant to let it run longer. But perhaps the unlimited hot water did less to make the brewhouse baths memorable than the youth, health, and freedom from care of the bather. The community was largely self-supporting. Every household grew its own vegetables, produced its new-laid eggs, and cured its own bacon. Jams and jellies, wines and pickles were made at home as a matter of course. Most gardens had a row of beehives. In the houses of the well-to-do there was an abundance of such foods, and even the poor enjoyed a rough plenty. The problem facing the lower-paid workers was not so much how to provide food for themselves and their families as how to obtain the 101 other things, such as clothing, boots, fuel, bedding and crockery ware, which had to be paid for in cash. Those with an income of 10 or 12 shillings a week often had to go short of such things, although the management and ingenuity of some of the women was amazing. Every morsel of old rag they could save or beg was made into rugs for the stone floors, or cut into fragments, to make flocks to stuff bedding. Sheets were turned outside into middle, and after they had again become worn, patched and patched again, until it was difficult to decide which part of a sheet was the original fabric. "Keep the flag flying," they would call to each other when they had their Monday morning washing flapping on the line. And the seeing eye and the feeling heart, had the possessor of these been present, would have read more than was meant into the saying. They kept the flag flying nobly, but the cost to themselves was great. Chapter 4. Penny Reading. In those days when young or progressive inhabitants of Candleford Green complained of the dullness of village life, the more staid would say, "It may be dull in some villages, but not here. Why, there's always something going on," which the dissatisfied could not deny, for although there was none of the amusement they desired, amusements of a kind were plentiful. No films, of course, for 20 years had yet to pass before Candleford town had its happydrome, and no dancing for the ordinary villager, except dancing on the green at holiday times in summer. But there were in winter the church social, with light refreshments and indoor games, and monthly penny readings, and a yearly concert in the schoolroom. Between these highlights of the social year, there were sewing parties which met at each of the members' houses in turn, when one of the members read aloud while the others sewed garments for the heathen or for the poor in cities. And tea was provided by the hostess of the occasion. The work parties were for the better-to-do. The cottagers had their mothers' meetings, which were very similar, except that there the members sewed for themselves and their families, materials provided at under-cost price by the ladies of the committee, and there was no tea. The reading aloud must have made slow progress, judging by the amount of talking done at both types of sewing party. The repetition of every spicy item of village gossip was prefaced by, "Mrs. So-and-so was saying at the working party," or "I heard somebody say at the mothers' meeting." The fact was that both were clearinghouses for gossip, but that did not make them less enjoyable. In summer there were the outings. That of the mothers' meeting, after weeks of discussion of more or less desirable seaside resorts, always decided for London and the zoo. The choir outing left in the small hours of the morning for Bournemouth or Weston-super-Mare, and the children's school treat outing went, waving flags and singing, in a horse wagonette to the vicarage paddock in a neighbouring village, where tea and buns were partaken of at a long trestle table under some trees. After tea, they ran races and played games, and returned home tired and grubby, but still noisy, to find even a larger crowd than had seen them off, waiting on the green to welcome them and join in their hip-hip hooray. The penny reading was a form of entertainment already out of date in most places, but at Candleford Green it was still going strong in the 90s. For it, the schoolroom was lent free of charge. "By kind permission of the managers," as stated upon the handbills, and the pennies taken at the door paid for heating and light. It was a popular as well as an inexpensive entertainment. Everybody went, whole families together, and all agreed that the excitement of going out after dark, carrying lanterns and sitting in a warm room with rows and rows of other people was well worth the sum of 1 penny, apart from the entertainment provided. The star turn was given by an old gentleman from a neighbouring village who, in his youth, had heard Dickens read his own works in public and aimed at reproducing in his own rendering the expression and mannerisms of the master. Old Mr. Greenwood put a tremendous amount of nervous energy into his reading. His features expressed as much as his voice, and his free hand was never still, and if the falsetto of his female characters sometimes rose to a screech, his facetious young men were almost too slyly humorous, and some of his listeners felt embarrassed when the deep, low voice he kept for pathetic passages broke and he had to pause to wipe away real tears. His rendering still had an authentic ring which to Dickens lovers was, as the villagers said about other items, well worth listening to. The bulk of his audience did not criticise, it enjoyed. The comic passages featuring Pickwick, Dick Swiveller or Sary Gamp were punctuated with bursts of laughter. Oliver Twist asking for more, and the deathbed of Little Nell drew tears from the women and throat clearings from the men. The reader was so regularly encored that he had been obliged to cut down his items on the programme to 2, which in effect was 4, and when he had finished his last reading, and with his hand on his heart, had bowed himself from the platform, people would sigh and say to each other, "Whatever comes next will sound dull after that." They showed so much interest that one would naturally have expected them to get Dickens' books, of which there were several in the parish library, to read for themselves. But with a very few exceptions they did not. For although they liked to listen, they were not readers. They were waiting, a public ready-made for the wireless and the cinema. Another penny reader whose items Laura enjoyed was a Mrs. Cox, who lived in the dower house on one of the neighbouring estates, and was said to be an American by birth. She was middle-aged, dressed unconventionally in loose, collarless frocks, usually green, and had short iron-grey hair which hung loose in curls like a modern bob. She always read from Uncle Remus, and her rendering of Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox and the Tar Baby may have owed something to some old black mammy of her childhood. The rich huskiness of her tone, her plantation dialect, and her flashing smile when delivering some side thrust of wit were charming. For the rest, some of the readings were well chosen, some ill-chosen. A few poems were interspersed between the prose passages, but these seldom rose higher than Excelsior, or The Village Blacksmith, or The Wreck of the Hesperus. Once, Laura had the honour of choosing 2 passages for the father of one of her friends, who had been invited to read, and could not, as he said, think of anything likely, not if his life depended upon it. She chose the scene from The Heart of Midlothian, in which Jeanie Deans is granted an audience by Queen Caroline, and the chapter about the Battle of Waterloo from Vanity Fair, which ends, "Darkness came down on the field and city, and Amelia was praying for George, who was lying on his face, dead, with a bullet through his heart." The man who read them said he thought they went down very well with the audience, but Laura did not notice any marked interest. For the homely penny reading, second best wear was considered sufficient, that being the last outfit before the newest, which, sponged and pressed and smartened up by the addition of a new ribbon bow and lace collar, had to serve another term for better wear before being taken into everyday use. At the annual concert, the audience appeared in church-going Sunday best. The young ladies contributing to the programme wore white or pale-coloured frocks with a modest V-neck and elbow sleeves, and the village girls who appeared on the platform, their last summer's frock with a flower in their hair, or an ivy wreath, or a bright ribbon bow. For the church social, summer frocks were worn by the girls. Last year's in most cases, but in a few, next year's made in advance and worn with the collar tucked in to give it an evening dress appearance. The older women wore black silk if they had it, if not, the stiffest and richest fabric they possessed or could afford to buy for the occasion. The fashion in dress was by that time more simple than it had been. The bustle had long passed away, and with it had gone panniers, waterfall backs, and other drapings on skirts. The new plain skirt was long and full and slightly stiffened at the hem to make it stand out well around the ankles. And with it went a blouse or bodice, as the upper part of a frock was still called, with balloon sleeves and a full loose front, often of a contrasting colour. Small waists were still fashionable, but the standard of smallness had changed. Women no longer aimed at an 18 or 20-inch span, but were satisfied with one of 22, 3 or 4 inches, and that had to be attained by moderate compression. The old savage tight lacing was a thing of the past. In hairdressing, the Royal or Alexandra fringe was the rage. For this, the hair was cut above the forehead and curled, or rather frizzed, to reach back almost to the crown. Considering that this style of hairdressing was introduced by the then Princess of Wales, whose beauty and goodness and taste as a leader of fashion was unchallenged, it is strange that it should have been condemned by many as fast. As in the case of bobbing during the last war, men and older women objected extravagantly to the fringe. But they had to get used to it. For, like the bob, it was a becoming fashion and it had come to stay. Fringes were worn all through the 90s. Laura, dressing for the church social in the cream nun's veiling frock in which she had been confirmed and in which her cousins Molly and Nellie had been confirmed before her, wondered if she might venture to cut and curl a few locks on her own forehead. If Miss Lane or her mother noticed them and objected, she would say they were little loose ends she had curled up to make them tidier, or if they passed unnoticed, she could cut and curl more, and so get a fringe by instalments. The stem of a new clay pipe borrowed from Matthew's bedroom served her as a substitute for curling tongs when heated in the flame of her candle, and she pushed her hat low down on her brow before going downstairs. There were comments and some criticism afterwards. Her brother told her she looked like a young prize bull, and her mother said, "It suits you, of course, but you're too young to go thinking of fashions." But by degrees, she got her fringe, and a troublesome job it was to keep it in curl in wet weather. The church social was strictly a village's affair. No one came from the great houses, and the clergyman only looked in once during the evening. The presence of the curate and Sunday school teachers guaranteed propriety. When the mothers had assisted with clearing away the tea and the long trestle tables had been removed, they seated themselves around the walls to watch the games. After postman's knock and musical chairs and here we go round the mulberry bush, a large ring was formed for dropping the handkerchief, and the fun of the evening began. "I wrote a letter to my love, and on the way I dropped it. One of you has picked it up and put it in your pocket," chanted the odd man or girl out as they circled the ring, handkerchief in hand, until they came to the back of the person they wished to choose and placed the handkerchief on his or her shoulder. The chase which followed took so long, round and round the ring, and always eventually out of one of the several doors, that 2 separate handkerchiefs kept 2 couples going in the church social version of the game. There was supposed to be no kissing, as it was a church function, but when the pursuer caught the pursued somewhere beyond the door with a smudged roller towel upon it, who could say what happened? Perhaps the youth sketched a stage kiss. Perhaps not. End of CD 2. CD 3. As the evening went on, the women and girls and young men and boys in the ring whirled hand in hand faster and faster, the girls' blue and pink and green skirts standing out like bells, and the young men's faces getting redder, until someone called out, "Time for Auld Lang Syne!" And hands were crossed, and the old song was sung, and people went home, in families or couples, according to age. Dancing would have been better, perhaps, but dropping the handkerchief served much the same purpose in that unsophisticated day. From such festivities, some of the older girls were seen home by young men. The engaged, of course, were already provided with an escort, and for that office, to certain unattached pretty and popular girls, there was keen rivalry. The young and not in any way outstanding girls, such as Laura, had to find their way home through the darkness alone, or join up with some family or group of friends which happened to be going their way. 1 year, and 1 year only, at the church social, after the singing of Auld Lang Syne, a young man approached Laura and said, bowing gravely as was the custom, "May I have the pleasure of seeing you home?" This caused quite a sensation among those immediately surrounding the pair, for the young man was the reporter for the local newspaper, and so looked upon as an outsider at such gatherings. His predecessor had sat about with a bored air between his dashes out to the Golden Lion, and once, when invited to join hands in the final singing, had refused and stood aloof in a corner, scribbling in his notebook. But he was a middle-aged man and inclined to give himself airs. This new reporter, who had appeared for the first time at Candleford Green that evening, was only a year or two older than Laura, and he had joined in the games and laughed and shouted as loudly as anybody. He had nice blue eyes and an infectious laugh, and of course, the notebook in which he scribbled shorthand notes was also attractive to Laura. So when he asked her if he might see her home, she was delighted to murmur the conventional, "That would be very kind of you." As they circled the green in the mild, damp air of the winter night, he told Laura about himself. He had only left school a few months before and was being given a month's trial by the editor of the Candleford News. The month of trial was almost over, and he would be leaving Candleford in a day or two, not because he had proved unsatisfactory, at least he hoped not, but because a much better opening had now been found for him by his parents on a newspaper in his hometown far up in the Midlands. "After that, Fleet Street, I suppose," suggested Laura, and they both laughed at that as an excellent joke and agreed that they both felt that they must have met before at some time, somewhere. Then they had to discuss the party they had come from and to laugh at some of the oddities there, which was wrong of Laura, who had been carefully trained never to make fun of the absent. The only excuse that can be found for her is that it was the first time she met anyone from the outside world near her own age and upon anything like equal terms, and that may have gone to her head a little. They laughed and chatted until they came to the post office door, then stood talking in hushed voices until their feet grew cold and her companion suggested that they should take another turn round the green to restore their circulation. They took several turns, for they began talking about books and forgot how late it was growing, and they might indeed have continued walking and talking all night, had not a light appeared at the post office door when Laura, after a hasty good night, hurried there to find Miss Lane looking out for her. Laura never saw Godfrey Parish again, but for some years they wrote to each other. His were amusing letters, written on the best editorial notepaper, thick and good, with a black embossed heading. As his letters often ran to 7 or 8 pages, his editor must sometimes have marvelled at the rapidity with which his private stock of notepaper became depleted. In return, Laura told him of any amusing little incident which occurred, and what books she was reading, until at last the correspondence languished, then ceased, in the usual manner of such pen friendships. Beyond having a relative or friend to stay with her occasionally, Miss Lane did little entertaining. She said she saw as much of her neighbours as she desired at the post office counter. But once a year she gave what she called her hay-home supper, and that to those of her household was a great occasion. She had 2 small paddocks beyond her garden, in one or other of which Peggy, the old chestnut mare, took her ease when her services were not required to draw the smiths with their tools in the spring cart to the hunting stables. Every spring, one of the paddocks was shut up for hay. Its yield was 1 small haystack, a quantity quite out of proportion to the bustle and excitement of the hay-home supper. But the making of hay for the ponies' winter fodder and the supper for all those who had worked for her in any capacity during the year was part of the traditional business and domestic economy handed down to Miss Lane by her parents and grandparents. Excepting Laura, the younger Smiths and Miss Lane herself, who was ageless, all at the hay-home supper were elderly or old. There were grey and white heads all around the table, and the custom itself was so hoary that must have been one of its last manifestations. For the haymaking, a queer old couple named Beer were engaged, not for the day, week, or season, but permanently. On some fine summer morning, without previous notice, Beer would come with his scythe to the back door and say, "Tell miss that grass being fine fettle now, and weather don't look too unkind like, and with her permission, I be now about to begin on't." When he had the grass lying in swathes, his wife appeared, and together they raked and turned and tossed and tedded, refreshed at short intervals by jugs of beer or tea provided by Miss Lane and carried to them by Zillah. Beer was a typical old countryman, ruddy and wizened, with very bright eyes, shrivelled and thin of figure and sagging at the knees, but still sprightly. His wife was also ruddy of face, but her figure was as round as a barrel. Instead of the usual sunbonnet, she wore for the haymaking a white muslin-frilled cap tied under the chin, and over it a broad-brimmed black straw hat, which made her look like an old-fashioned Welshwoman. She was a merry old soul, with a fat, chuckling laugh, and when she laughed her face wrinkled up until her eyes disappeared. She was much in request as a midwife. When the hay was dried and in cocks, Bear came to the door again. "Ma'am, ma'am," he would call, "we be ready." That was the signal for the smiths to turn out and build the hayrick, with Peggy herself and her spring cart to do the carrying. All that day there was much running to and fro and shouting and merriment. Indoors the kitchen table was laid with pies and tarts and custards, and in the place of honour at the head of the table, the dish of the evening, a stuffed collar chine of bacon. When the company assembled, large foaming jugs of beer would be drawn for the men and for those of the women who preferred it. A jug of homemade lemonade with a sprig of borage floating at the top circulated at the upper end of the table. For the stuffed chine, the largest dish in the house had to be used. It was a great round joint, being the whole neck of a pig, cut and cured specially for the hay-home supper. It was lavishly stuffed with sage and onions, and was altogether very rich and highly flavoured. It would not have suited modern digestions, but most of those present at the hay-home supper ate of it largely and enjoyed it. Old Mr. Beer, in the little speech he made after supper, never forgot to mention the chine. "I've been a-making hay in them fields for this 46 years, he would say. "In your time, ma'am, and your fathers and your grandfers before you, and the stuffed chines I've eaten at the suppers have always been of the best. But of all the chines I've tasted in this kitchen, that of which I sees remains before me, if remains they can be called, for you wants to put on your spectacles to see 'em, were the finest and fattest and tastiest of any." After Miss Lane had replied to the speech of thanks, homemade wine was brought out, tobacco and snuff handed round, and songs were sung. It was a point of strict etiquette that every guest should contribute something to the programme, irrespective of musical ability. The songs were sung without musical accompaniment, and many of them without a recognisable tune, but what they may have lacked in harmony was more than made up for in length. Every year when Laura was present, Mr. Beer obliged with his famous half-song, half-recitation, relating the adventures of an Oxfordshire man on a trip to London. It began. "Last Michaelmas I remember well, when harvests were all over, our chaps had stacked up all the beans and raked up all the clover," which lull in the year's work gave one Sam the daring idea of taking a trip to town. "For Sal went there a year ago along with Squire Brown, housemaid or summit, don't know what, to live in Lunnon town. And they behaved right well to Sal and gave her clothes and that, and Sal have nation well to them and got quite tall and fat." So Sam thought if Mr. approved, he would pay his sister a visit. If Mr. refused permission, Sam said in quite a modern spirit, "Old Grosgrain then must give I work, a rum old fellow he. He grumbles when he sets us on, but dang it, what care we?" But he had still his mother to deal with. She cried aloud to break her heart at parting thus with me, but cheered up and began to look into ways and means. "Well, since you all so headstrong be, some rigging we must get. I'll wash ye out another shirt and sprig ye up a bit." And gave as her parting advice, "Now, Sam, ave well where you be gwain. Whatever others does to you, be sure don't turn again." To which Sam replied, "Yes, very purty, fancy that now, blow me jacket tight. If they begins their rigs with me, I'll purty soon show fight." And cut himself a good stout ash stick before setting out in his Holland smock as good as new, on foot to Lunnon town. To her children's disgust in after years, Laura's memory left him, newly arrived on London Bridge, asking passers-by if they knew our Sal or mayhap Squire Brown. But there were stanzas and stanzas after that. That one song, in fact, accounted for a good part of the evening, but no one then present found it too long, for the younger Smiths had slipped one by one out of the door, and those left, excepting Laura and Miss Lane, were old and loved the old, slow, country manner of rejoicing. They sat around the table, Mrs. Beer with her arms folded on her comfortable stomach, and one ear always open to catch what she called a bidding. For, "My dear, 'tis a mortal truth that babbies like to come arter dark. For why? So's nobody should see their blessed little spirits come winging." Bear himself beaming on all and inclined to hiccups towards the end of the evening. The old washerwoman's worn fingers fingering her muslin cap, only worn on special occasions. Zillah, important and fussy, acting the part of a second hostess. And Matthew with his old blue eyes shining with gratification at the laughter which greeted his jokes. Miss Lane, very upright at the head of the table in her claret-coloured silk, looked like a visitant from another sphere, well weighted down to earth, though, by her gold chains and watch and brooches and locket. And Laura, in pink print, ran in and out with plates and glasses because it was Zillah's evening off. That was the hay-home supper, a survival, though perhaps not more ancient than a couple of 100 years or so, a mere babe of a survival compared to the village feast. The maypole had long been chopped up for firewood. The Morris dance was fading out as one after another the old players died, and Plough Monday had become an ordinary working day. But at Candleford Green, the feast was still a general holiday, as it must have been from the day upon which the church was dedicated, far back in the centuries. Some kind of feast may have been held on the green before that time, some pagan rite, for even in the respectable latter part of the 19th century, there was more of a pagan than a Christian spirit abroad at the feast celebrations. It was essentially a people's holiday. The clergy and the local gentlepeople had no hand in it. They avoided the green on that day. Even the youngest of country house parties had not yet discovered the delights of hurdy-gurdy music and naphtha flares, of shouting oneself hoarse in swing boats and waving paper streamers while riding mechanical ostriches. With one exception to be mentioned hereafter, only a few of the underservants from the great houses appeared on the green on Feast Monday. For those who liked feasts, there were booths and stalls and coconut shies and shooting galleries and swing boats, and a merry-go-round and a brass band for dancing. All the fun of the fair, in fact. From early morning, people poured in from the neighbouring villages and from Candleford town. Candleford Green people were proud of this display. It showed how the place had come on, they said, for the largest and most brilliantly painted and lit merry-go-round in the county to find it worthwhile to attend their feast. Old men could remember when there had only been one booth with a two-headed calf or a fat lady and a few poor stalls selling gingerbread, or the pottery images still to be seen in some of their cottages, representing a couple in bed in nightcaps, and the bedroom utensils showing beneath the bed valance. In those early days there had been no merry-go-round, but for the children, they said, there was old Hickman's whirligig, apparently the parent of the modern merry-go-round. It was made entirely of wood, with an outside circle of plain wooden seats which revolved by means of a hand-turned device in the centre. It was a one-man show. When old Hickman grew tired, a boy bystander was invited to take his place at the handle, the promised reward being a ride for every 20 minutes' labour. While the old men were still boys, this primitive merry-go-round collapsed, and they made a rhyme about it which ran, "Old Jim Hickman's whirligig broke down. Broke and let the wenches down. If that had been made of ash or oak, I'll be blowed if that'd have broke." Old Hickman's whirligig had broken down and gone to the bonfire 50 years before, and only Laura cared to hear about it. That, she was told, was because she was one of the quiet, old-fashioned sort. But still waters run deep, they would remind her, and there were plenty of sweethearts to go round and suit all. There were plenty of sweethearts on the green on Feast Monday, pairs and pairs and pairs of them, the girls in their best summer frocks, with flowers or feathers in their hats, and the young men in their Sunday suits, with pink or blue ties. With arms round each other's waists, they strolled from one sight to the next, eating sweets or sections of coconut, or took turns on the merry-go-round or in the swing boats. All day, the roundabout organ ground out its repertoire of popular tunes in competition with the brass band playing a different tune at the other end of the green. Swing boats appeared and disappeared over the canvas roofs of the booths, and the occupants, now head upwards, now feet upwards, shrieked with excitement and cheered each other on to go higher and still higher, while below, on the trampled turf, people of all ages threaded the narrow passages between the shows, laughing and shouting and eating. Always eating. "What crowds!" people cried. "It's the best feast we've ever had! If the green could only always look like this! And I do dearly love a bit of good music." The noise was deafening. The few quiet people who stayed indoors put cotton wool in their ears. One year, when a poor woman was dying on Feast Monday in a cottage near the green, her friends went out and begged that the band would stop playing for an hour. The band, of course, could not stop playing, but the bandsman offered to muffle the drumsticks, and for the rest of the afternoon, the drums dum-dum-dum sounded a memento mori amidst the rejoicings. Very few noticed it. The other noises were too many and too loud, and by tea-time its resonance was restored, for the woman had died. Every year, among the cottagers and showfolk and maidservants and farmhands at the feast, there was one aristocratic figure. It was that of a young man, the eldest son of a peer, who for years frequented all the feasts and fairs and club walkings of the countryside. Laura knew him well by sight, for his ancestral mansion was not far from her own home. From her window at Candleford Green Post Office, she once saw him leaning languidly against the pay-box of a coconut shy, surrounded by a bevy of girls who were having tries at the coconuts at his expense. His dress was that of a country gentleman of his time, tweed Norfolk suit and deerstalker cap, and that and his air of ironic detachment set him apart from the crowd and helped out his Childe Harold pose. All day he was surrounded by village girls, waiting to be treated to the different shows, and from these he would select one favourite with whom to dance the evening through. His group was a centre of interest. "Have you seen Lord So-and-so?" people would ask, just as they might have asked, "Have you seen the fat lady or the peep show?" And they openly pointed him out to each other as one of the sights of the feast. The heroine of a modern novel would have seized such an opportunity to go out into the throng and learn a little at first hand about life. But this is a true story, and Laura was not of the stuff of which heroines are made. A born looker-on, she preferred to watch from her window, excepting one year when her brother Edmund came and took her out and knocked off so many coconuts from the shy that its proprietor refused his penny for another go, saying in aggrieved tones, "I know your sort, you've been practising." Early in the evening, the merry-go-round packed up and departed. It had only stopped there to put in a day on its way to a larger and more remunerative fair in the locality. After its organ had gone, the strains of the band music could be heard, and the number of dancers increased. Shopgirls and their swains arrived from Candleford town. Farm workers from outlying villages came, arm in arm with their girls. Men and maidservants from the great houses stole out for an hour, and an occasional passer-by, attracted by the sounds of revelry, came forward and found a partner. Stalls and booths were taken down, and their owners departed. Tired family parties trailed home through the dust, and unattached men retired to the public houses. But for many there, the fun was only beginning. The music went on, and the pale summer frocks of the girl dancers glimmered on in the twilight. Chapter 5. Neighbours. In the early 90s, the change which had for some time been going on in the outer world had reached Candleford Green. A few old-fashioned country homes, such as that of Miss Lane, might still be seen there, especially among those of the farming class, and long-established family businesses still existed side by side with those newly established or brought up to date. But as the older householders died and the proprietors of the old-fashioned businesses died or retired, the old gave place to the new. Tastes and ideas were changing. Quality was less in demand than it had been. The old solid handmade productions into which good materials and many hours of patient skilled craftsmanship had been put were comparatively costly. The new machine-made goods cost less and had the further attraction of a meretricious smartness. Also, they were fashionable, and most people preferred them on that account. Time, like an ever-rolling stream, bears all its sons away. And its daughters too, and the tastes and ideas of each generation, together with its ideals and conventions, go rolling downstream with it like so much debris. But because the generations overlap, the change is gradual. In the country at the time now recorded, the day of the old skilled master craftsman, though waning, was not over. Across the green, almost opposite to the post office, stood a substantial cottage, end to end with a carpenter's shop. In most weathers, the big double door of the workshop stood open, and white-aproned workmen with their feet ankle-deep in shavings could be seen sawing and planing and shaping at the benches, with, behind them, a window framing a glimpse of a garden with old-fashioned flowers and a grapevine draping a grey wall. There lived and worked the three Williams, father, son, and grandson. With the help of a couple of journeymen, they not only did all the carpentry and joinery of the district at a time when no doors or mantelpieces or window frames came ready-made from abroad, but they also made and mended furniture for the use of the living and made coffins for the dead. There was no rival shop. The elder William was the carpenter of the village, just as Miss Lane was the postmistress and Mr. Coulsdon the vicar. Although less popular than the smithy as a gathering place, the carpenter's shop had also its habitués, older and graver men, as a rule, especially choir men, for the eldest William played the organ in church and the middle William was choirmaster. Old Mr. Stokes not only played the organ, but he had built it with his own hands, and these services to the church and to music had given him a unique local standing. But he was almost as much valued for his great experience and his known wisdom. To him, the villagers went in trouble or difficulty, and he was never known to fail them. He had been Miss Lane's father's close and intimate friend, and was then her own. At the time Laura knew him, he was nearly 80 and much troubled by asthma, but he still worked at his trade occasionally, with his long, lean form swathed in a white apron and his full white beard buttoned into his waistcoat. And on summer evenings, when the rolling peal of the organ came from the open door of the church, passers-by would say, "That's old Mr. Stokes playing, I'll lay, and he's playing his own music too, I shouldn't wonder." Sometimes he was playing his own music, for he would improvise for hours, but he loved more to play for his own pleasure the music of the masters. The second William was unlike his father in appearance, being short and thick of figure, while his father was as straight and almost as thin as a lat. His face resembled that of Dante Gabriel Rossetti so closely that Laura, on seeing the portrait of that poet-painter in later years, exclaimed, "Mr. William!" For of course he was called Mr. William. His father was always spoken of respectfully as Mr. Stokes, and his nephew as Young Willie. Like his father, Mr. William was both musician and craftsman of the old school. and it was naturally expected that, as a matter of course, these gifts would descend to the third William. It had been a proud day for old Mr. Stokes when young Willie's indentures were signed, for he thought he saw in them an assured future for the old family business. When he was at rest, and his son, there would still be a William Stokes, carpenter and joiner of Candleford Green, and after that perhaps still another William to follow. But Willie himself was not so sure. He had been legally apprenticed to his grandfather's business, as was the custom in family establishments in those days, rather because it was the line laid down for him than because he desired to become a carpenter. His work in the shop was to him but work, not a fine art or a religion, and for the music so sacred to his elders, he had but a moderate taste. He was a tall, slim boy of 16, with beautiful hazel eyes and a fair, too fair, pink and white complexion. Had his mother or his grandmother been alive, his alternating fits of lassitude and devil-may-care high spirits would have been recognised as a sign that he was outgrowing his strength and that his health needed care. But the only woman in his grandfather's house was a middle-aged cousin of the middle William who acted as housekeeper. A hard, gaunt, sour-looking woman whose thoughts and energies were centred upon keeping the house spotless. When the front door of their house was opened upon the small bare hall, with its grandfather's clock and oilcloth floor covering patterned with lilies, an intruding nose was met by the clean, cold smell of soap and furniture polish. Everything in that house, which could be scrubbed, was scrubbed to a snowy whiteness. Not a chair or a rug or a picture frame was ever a hairbreadth out of place. Horsehair chair and sofa coverings were polished to a cold slipperiness. Tabletops might have served as mirrors, and an air of comfortless order pervaded the whole place. It was indeed a model house in the matter of cleanliness, but as a home for a delicate, warm-hearted orphan boy, it fell short. The kitchen was the only inhabited room. There the 3 generations of Williams took their meals, and there they carefully removed their shoes before retiring to the bedrooms, which were sleeping places only. To come home with wet clothes on a rainy day was accounted a crime. The drying of them messed up the place. So Willie, who was the only one of the 3 to be out in such weather, would change surreptitiously and leave his clothes to dry as they might, or not dry. His frequent colds left him with a cough that lingered every year into the spring. "A churchyard cough," the older villagers said, and shook their heads knowingly. But his grandfather did not appear to notice this. Although he loved him tenderly, he had too many other interests to be able to keep a close watch over his grandson's physical well-being. He left that to the cousin, who was absorbed in her housework and already felt it a hardship to have what she called a great hulking hobbledehoy in the house to mess up her floors and rugs, and made enough cooking and washing up for a regiment. Willie did not care for the music his grandfather and uncle loved. He preferred the banjo, and such popular songs as "Oh, Dem Golden Slippers" and "Two Lovely Black Eyes" to organ fugues. Except in church, where he sometimes sang the anthem, looking like an angel in his white surplice. Yet in other ways he had a great love of and craving for beauty. "I do like deep, rich colours. Violet and crimson and the blue of these delphiniums, don't you?" he said to Laura in Miss Lane's garden one day. Laura loved those colours too. She was almost ashamed to answer the questions in the confession books of her more fashionable friends. "Favourite colours? Purple and crimson. Favourite flowers? The red rose. Favourite poet? Shakespeare." The answers made her appear so unoriginal. She almost envied previous writers in the books their preferences when she read, "Favourite flower? Petunia, orchid or sweet pea." But she had not as yet the social wit to say, "Favourite flower? After the rose, of course," or to pay mere lip service to Shakespeare, so she was obliged to appear obvious. Willie was fond of reading too, and did not object to poetry. Somehow he had got possession of an old shattered copy of an anthology called 1,001 Gems, and when he came to tea with Miss Lane, who had known his mother and had a special affection for him, he would bring this book, and after office hours Laura and he would sit among the nut trees at the bottom of the garden and take turns at reading aloud from it. Those were the days for Laura, when almost everything in literature was new to her, and every fresh discovery was like one of Keats's own magic casements opening on the foam. Between the shabby old covers of that one book were The Ode to a Nightingale, Shelley's Skylark, Wordsworth's Ode to Duty, and other gems which could move to a heart-shaking rapture. Willie took their readings more calmly. He liked where Laura loved, but he did honestly like, and that meant much to Laura, for none of those she had previously known in her short life, except her brother Edmund, cared twopence for poetry. But one incident she shared with Willie remained more vivid in her memory than the poetry readings or the scrapes he got into with other boys, such as being let down into a well by the chain to rescue a duck which had spent a day and a night quacking loudly as it searched in vain for a shore to that deep, narrow pool into which it had tumbled, or the time when the hayrick was on fire, and against the advice of older men, he climbed to the top to beat the burning thatch with a rake. She had gone one day to his home with a message from Miss Lane to the housekeeper, and finding no one at home in the house, had crossed the yard to a shed where Willie was working. He was sorting out planks, and intending to tease, and perhaps to shock her, he showed her a pile at the farther end of the shed in the semi-darkness. "Just look at these," he said. "Here, come right in and put your hand on them. Know what they're for? Well, I'll tell you. They're all and every one of them sides for coffins. I wonder who this one's for, and this, and this. This nice little narrow one may be for you. It looks about the right size. And this one at the bottom," touching it with his toes, "may be for that very chap we can hear kicking up such a row with his whistling outside. They're all booked for somebody, mostly somebody we know, but there aren't any names written on them." Laura pretended to laugh and called him a horrid boy, but the bright day seemed to her suddenly to become dark and cold, and afterwards, whenever she passed that shed, she shivered and thought of the pile of coffin boards waiting in the half-darkness until they should be needed to make coffins for people now going happily about the green on their business and passing the shed without a shudder. The elm or the oak which had yet to make her coffin must then have been growing green somewhere or other, and Willie had no coffin tree growing for him, for his was a soldier's grave out on the veldt in South Africa. He, the youngest, was the first of the three Williams to go. Soon after, the middle William died suddenly while working at his bench, and his father followed him next winter. Then the carpenter's shop was demolished to make way for a builder's showroom with baths and tiled fireplaces and WC pans in the window. And only the organ in church and pieces of good woodwork in houses remained to remind those who had known them of the three Williams. Squeezed back to leave space for a small front garden, between the stores and the carpenter's shop was a tall, narrow cottage with 3 sash windows, one above the other, which almost filled the front wall. In the lowest window stood a few bottles of bull's-eyes and other boiled sweets, and above them hung a card which said, "Dressmaking and plain sewing." This was the home of one of the 2 postwomen who every morning carried the letters to outlying houses off the regular postman's beat. Unlike her colleague, who was old, grumpy and snuffy, Mrs. Macy was no ordinary countrywoman. She spoke well and had delicate, refined, if somewhat worn features, with nice grey eyes and a figure of the kind of which country people said, "So-and-so'd manage to look well dressed if she went round wrapped in a dishcloth." And Mrs. Macy did manage to look well dressed, although her clothes were usually shabby and sometimes peculiar. For most of the year on her round, she wore a long grey cloth coat of the kind then known as an ulster, and for headgear, a man's black bowler hat draped with a black lace veil with short ends hanging at the back. This hat, Miss Lane said, was a survival of a fashion of 10 years before. Laura had never seen another like it, but worn as Mrs. Macy wore it, over a head of softly waving dark hair, drawn down into a little tight knob on the neck, it was decidedly becoming. Instead of plodding or sauntering country fashion, Mrs. Macey walked firmly and quickly, as if with a destination in view. Excepting Miss Lane, who was more of a patron than a friend, Mrs. Macey had no friends in the village. She had been born and had lived as a child on a farm near Candleford Green, where her father was then bailiff. But before she had grown up, her family had gone away, and all that was known locally of 15 years of her life was that she had married and lived in London. Then, 4 or 5 years before Laura knew her, she had returned to the village with her only child, at that time a boy of 7, and taken the cottage next to the stores and put the card in the window. When the opportunity offered, Miss Lane obtained for her the letter carrier's post, and with the 4 shillings a week pay for that, a weekly postal order for the same amount from some mysterious organisation, the Freemasons, it was whispered, but that was a mere guess, and the money earned by her sewing, she was able in those days, and in that locality, to live and bring up her boy in some degree of comfort. She was not a widow, but she never mentioned her husband unless questioned, when she would say something about travelling abroad with his gentleman, leaving her hearer to conclude that he was a valet or something of that kind. Some people said she had no husband and never had had one. She had only invented one as a blind to account for her child. But Miss Lane nipped such suspicions in the bud by saying authoritatively that she had good reasons, which she was not at liberty to reveal, for saying that Mrs. Macey had a husband still living. Laura liked Mrs. Macey, and often crossed the green to her house in the evening to buy a screw of sweets, or to try on a garment which was being made or turned or lengthened for her. It was as cosy a little place as can be imagined. The ground floor of the house had formerly been one largish room with a stone floor, but by erecting a screen to enclose the window and fireplace, and cut off the draughty outer portion, where water vessels and cooking utensils were kept, Mrs. Macey had contrived a tiny inner living room. In this she had a table for meals, a sofa and easy chair, and her sewing machine. There were rugs on the floor, and pictures on the walls, and plenty of cushions about. These were all of good quality, relics, no doubt, of the much larger home she had had during her married life. There Laura would sit by the fire and play Ludo with Tommy, with Snowball the white cat on her knee, while Mrs. Macey, on the other side of the hearth, stitched away at her sewing. She did not talk much, but she would sometimes look up, and her eyes would smile a welcome. She seldom smiled with her lips, and scarcely ever laughed, and because of this, some villagers called her sour-looking. A sour-looking creature, they said. But anyone with more penetration would have known that she was not sour, but sad. "Ah, you're young," she once said when Laura had been talking a lot. "You've got all your life before you," as though her own life was over, although she was not much over 30. Her Tommy was a quiet, thoughtful little lad, with the man-of-the-house air of responsibility sometimes worn by fatherless only sons. He liked to wind up the clock, let out the cat, and lock the house door at night. Once when he had brought home a blouse which Mrs. Macey had been making out of an old muslin frock for Laura, and with it the bill, for some now incredibly small amount, a shilling at the most, probably 9pence, Laura, by way of a mild joke, handed him her pencil and said, "Perhaps you'll give me a receipt for the money?" "With pleasure," he said in his best grown-up manner, "but it's really not necessary. We shan't charge you for it again." Laura smiled at that "we," denoting a partnership in which the junior partner was so very immature, then felt sad as she thought of the two of them, entrenched in that narrow home against the world, with some mysterious background which could be felt but not fathomed. Whatever the nature of the mystery surrounding the father, the boy knew nothing about it, for twice in Laura's presence he asked his mother, "When will our daddy come home?" And his mother, after a long pause, replied, "Oh, not for a long time yet. He's travelling abroad, you know, and his gentleman's not ready to come home." The first time she added, "I expect they're shooting tigers," and the next, "It's a long way to Spain." Once Tommy, in all innocence, brought out and showed Laura his father's photograph. It was that of a handsome, flashy-looking man posing before the rustic work background of a photographer's studio. A top hat and gloves were carefully arranged on a little table beside him. Not a working man, evidently, and yet he did not look quite like a gentleman, thought Laura, but it was no business of hers, and when she saw Mrs. Macy's pained look as she took away the photograph, she was glad that she had barely glanced at it. At one end of the green, balancing the doctor's house at the other end, stood what was known there as a quality house, which meant one larger than a cottage but smaller than a mansion. There were several such houses in the neighbourhood of Candleford Green, mostly occupied by ladies, elderly, maiden or widowed, but here there lived only one gentleman. It was a white house with a green-painted balcony, green outside shutters, and a beautifully kept lawn with clipped yew trees. It was a quiet house, for Mr. Reppington was a very old gentleman, and there were no young people to run in and out, or to go to parties or hunting. His maidservants were elderly and uncommunicative, and his own man, Mr. Grimshaw, was as white-headed as his master, and as unapproachable. Sometimes on summer afternoons, a carriage with champing horses, glittering harness, and cockaded coachman and footman would stand at the gate, while from within, through the open windows, came the sounds of tinkling teacups and ladies' voices, gossiping pleasantly, and every year at strawberry time, Mr. Reppington gave one garden party to which the local gentlepeople came on foot, because his stabling accommodation and that of the inn was strained to the utmost by the equipages of guests from farther afield. That was all he did in the way of entertaining. He had long given up dining out or dining others on account of his age. Every morning at precisely 11 o'clock, Mr. Reppington would emerge from his front door, held ceremoniously open for him by Grimshaw, visit the post office and the carpenter's shop, stand for a few minutes to talk to the vicar or anyone else of his own class whom he happened to meet, pat a few children on the head, and give a knob of sugar to the donkey. Then, having made the circuit of the green, he would disappear through his own doorway and be seen no more until the next morning. His dress was a model of style. The pale grey suits he favoured in summer always looked fresh from the tailor's hand, and his spats and grey suede gloves were immaculate. He carried a gold-headed cane and wore a flower in his buttonhole, usually a white carnation or a rosebud. Once, when he met Laura out in the village, he swept off his Panama hat in a bow so low that she felt like a princess. But his manners were always courtly. It was not at all surprising to be told that he had formerly held some position at the court of Queen Victoria, which perhaps he had, perhaps not, for nothing was really known about him, excepting that he was apparently rich and obviously aged. Laura and Miss Lane knew, and the postman may have noticed, that he had many letters with crests and coronets on the flap of the envelope, and Laura knew that he had once sent a telegram signed with his Christian name to a very great personage indeed. But his servants being what they were, such things were not matter for village gossip. Like all those of good birth Laura met when in business, his voice was quiet and natural, and he was pleasant in his manner towards her. One morning he found her alone in the office, and perhaps intending to cheer what he may have thought her loneliness, he asked, "Do you like ciphers?" Laura was not at all sure what kind of a cipher he meant. It could not be the figure 0, surely. But she said, "Yes, I think so." And he wrote with a tiny gold pencil on a leaf torn from his pocketbook. "You owe A.O., but I owe thee. I give thee A.O., but O owe me." Which, seeing her puzzled look, he interpreted, "You sigh for a cipher, but I sigh for thee. I give thee a cipher, but O sigh for me." And on another occasion he handed her the riddle, "The beginning of eternity, the end of time and space, the beginning of every end, and the end of every place." To which she soon discovered that the answer was the letter E. Laura wondered in riper years how many times and in how many different environments he had written those very puzzles to amuse other girls, unlike her in everything but age. There were a number of small cottages around the green, most of them more picturesque than that occupied by Mrs. Macey. Of these, Laura knew every one of the occupants, at least well enough to be on speaking terms, through seeing them at the post office. She did not know them as intimately as she had known similar families in her native hamlet, where she had been one of them and had had a lifelong experience of their circumstances. At Candleford Green, she was more in the position of an outside observer, aided by the light of her previous experiences. They appeared to have a similar home life to that of the Larkrise people, and to possess much the same virtues, weaknesses, and limitations. They spoke with the same country accent, and used many of the old homely expressions. Their vocabulary may have been larger, for they had adopted most of the new catchwords of their day, but as Laura thought afterwards, they used it with less vigour. One new old saying, however, Laura heard for the first time at Candleford Green. It was used on an occasion when a woman, newly widowed, had tried to throw herself into her husband's grave at his funeral. Then someone who had witnessed the scene said dryly in Laura's hearing, "Ah, you wait. The bellowing cow is always the first to forget its calf." The Candleford Green workers lived in better cottages, and many of them were better paid than the Larkrise people. They were not all of them farm labourers. There were skilled craftsmen amongst them, and some were employed to drive vans by the tradesmen there and in Candleford town. But wages for all kinds of work were low, and life for most of them must have been a struggle. The length of raised sidewalk before the temptingly dressed windows of the stores was the favourite afternoon promenade of the women, with or without perambulators. There, the Rage or the Latest, so ticketed, might be seen free of charge, and the purchase of a reel of cotton or a paper of pins gave the right of entry to a further display of fashions. On Sundays, the two Mrs. Pratt displayed the cream of their stock upon their own persons in church. They were tall, thin young women, with frizzy Alexandra fringes of straw-coloured hair, high cheekbones, and anaemic complexions which they touched up with rouge. At the font, they had been given the pretty old-fashioned names of Prudence and Ruth, but for business purposes, as they explained, they had exchanged them for the more high-sounding and up-to-date ones of Pearl and Ruby. The new names passed into currency sooner than might have been expected, for few of their customers cared to offend them. They might have retaliated by passing off on the offender an unbecoming hat, or by skimping the sleeves of a new Sunday gown. So to their faces they were Miss Pearl and Miss Ruby, while behind their backs, as often as not, it would be that Ruby Pratt as she calls herself, or Pearl as ought to be Prudence. Miss Ruby ran the dressmaking department, and Miss Pearl reigned in the millinery showroom. Both were accepted authorities upon what was being worn and the correct manner of wearing it. If anyone in the village was planning a new summer outfit and was not sure of the style, she would say, "I must ask the Miss Pratts." And although some of the resulting creations might have astonished leaders of fashion elsewhere, they were accepted by their customers as models. In Laura's time, the Pratts' customers included the whole feminine population of the village, excepting those rich enough to buy elsewhere, and those too poor to buy at all at first hand. They were good enough girls, enterprising, hard-working, and clever, and if Laura thought them conceited, that may have been because she had been told that Miss Pearl had said to a customer in the showroom that she wondered that Miss Lane had not been able to find someone more genteel than that little country girl to assist her in her office. At the time of her marriage, it was said, their mother had been looked upon as an heiress, having not only inherited the stores, then a plain draper's shop with rolls of calico and red flannel in the window, but also cottages and grazing land, bringing in rent. So it may be supposed she felt justified in marrying where her fancy led her. It led her to marriage with a smart young commercial traveller whose round had brought him to the shop periodically, and together they had introduced modern improvements. When the new plate-glass windows had been put in, the dressmaking and millinery departments established, and the shop renamed The Stores, the husband's efforts had ended, and for the rest of his life he had felt himself entitled to spend most of his waking hours in the bar parlour of the Golden Lion, laying down the law to other commercial gentlemen who had not done so well for themselves. "There goes that old Pratt again, shaking like a leaf and as thin as a hurdle," Miss Lane would say, when taking her morning survey of the green from her window, and Laura, glancing up from her work, would see the thin figure in loud tweeds and white bowler hat making for the door of the inn, and know, without looking at the clock, that it was exactly 11. Sometime during the day he would go home for a meal, then return to his own special seat in the bar parlour, where he would remain until closing time. At home his wife grew old and shrivelled and complaining, while the girls grew up and shouldered the business, just in time to stop its decline. At the time Laura knew them, their Ma, as her daughters called her, had become an invalid on whom they lavished the tenderest care, obtaining far-fetched dainties to tempt her appetite, filling her room with flowers, and staging there a private show of their latest novelties before they were displayed to the public. "No, not that one, please, Mrs. Perkins," Miss Pearl said to a customer in Laura's hearing one day. "I'm ever so sorry, but it's the new fashion. Only just come in and Ma's not seen it yet. I'd take it upstairs now to show her, but she takes her little siesta at this hour. Well, if you really don't mind stepping round again in the morning." If, through absent-mindedness or a lost sense of direction, Pa wandered in his hat and coat into the showroom, he was gently but firmly led out by a seemingly playful daughter. "Dear Papa," Miss Pearl would exclaim, "he does take such an interest. But come along, darling. Come with your own little Pearlie. Mind the step now. Gently does it. What you want is a nice strong cup of tea." No wonder the Pratt girls looked, as some people said, as if they had the weight of the world on their shoulders. They must in reality have carried a biggish burden of trouble, and if they tried to hide it with a show of high spirits and simpering smiles, plus a little harmless pretension, that should have been put down to their credit. Human nature being what it is, their shifts and pretences only served to provoke a little mild amusement. But by the time Laura went to live at Candleford Green, the Pratts was an old story, until one summer morning a first-class sensation was provided for the villagers by the news that Mr. Pratt had disappeared. He had left the inn at the usual time, closing time, but had never reached home. His daughters had sat up for him, gone after midnight to the Golden Lion to inquire, and then headed the search in the lanes in the early dawn. But there was still no trace, and the police were about asking questions of early workmen. Would they circulate his photograph? Would there be a reward? And above all, what had become of the man? Thin as he was, he couldn't have fallen down a crack like. The search went on for days. Station masters were questioned, woods were searched foot by foot, wells and ponds were dragged, but no trace could be found of Mr. Pratt, dead or alive. Ruby and Pearl, their first grief abating, took counsel with friends as to whether or not to wear mourning. But no, they decided, poor Pa might yet return, and they compromised by appearing in church in lavender frocks with touches of mauve, half or perhaps quarter mourning. As time went on, the back door, which so far had been left on the latch at night in case of the return of the prodigal father, was again locked, and perhaps when alone with Ma, they admitted with a sigh that all might be for the best. But they had not heard the last of poor Pa. One morning, nearly a year later, when Miss Ruby had got up very early, and the maid, still being in bed, had herself gone to the woodshed for sticks to boil a kettle to make tea, she found her father peacefully sleeping on a bed of brushwood. Where he had been all those months he could not or would not say. He thought or pretended to think that there had been no interval of time, that he had come home as usual from the Golden Lion the night before he was found, and finding the door locked, and not liking to disturb the household, had retired to the woodshed. The one and only clue to the mystery, and that did not solve it, was that in the early dawn of the day before that of his reappearance, a cyclist on the Oxford Road, a few miles out of that city, had passed on the road a tall, thin, elderly man in a deerstalker cap, walking with his head bent and sobbing. Where he had been and how he had managed to live while he was away was never found out. He resumed his visits to the Golden Lion, and his daughters shouldered their burden again. By them, the episode was always afterwards referred to as "poor Pa's loss of memory." The grocer's business next door to the Pratts was also a thriving and long-established one. From a business point of view, Tarman's had one advantage over the stores, for while the drapers depended chiefly on the middle state of village society, the poor not being able to afford to buy their models and the gentry despising them, the grocer catered for all. At that time, the more important village people, such as the doctor and clergyman, bought their provisions at the village shops as a matter of principle. They would have thought it mean to go further afield for the sake of saving a few shillings, and even the rich, who spent only part of the year at their country houses or their hunting boxes, believed it to be their duty to give the local tradesmen a turn. If there happened to be more businesses than one of a kind in a village, orders were placed with each alternately. Even Miss Lane had 2 bakers, one calling one week and the other the next, but in her case it may have been more a matter of business than of principle, as both bakers had horses to be shod. This custom of local dealing benefited all the inhabitants. The shopkeeper was able to keep more varieties of goods in stock, and often of a better quality than he would otherwise have done. His cheerful, well-lighted shop brightened the village street, and he himself made enough money in the way of profit to enable him to live in substantial comfort. A grocer had to be a grocer then, for his goods did not come to him in packets, ready to be handed over the counter, but had to be selected and blended and weighed out by himself. And for quality, he was directly responsible to his customers. The butcher, too, received no stiff, shrouded carcasses by rail, but had to be able to recognise the points in the living animal at the local market sufficiently quickly and well to be able to guarantee the succulent joints, and the old-fashioned chops and steaks would melt in the mouth. Even his scrag ends of mutton and 6 of pieces of beef, which he sold to the poor, were tasty and rich with juices, which the refrigerator seems to have destroyed in present-day meat. However, we cannot have it always, and most villagers would agree that the attractions of films and wireless and dances and buses to town, plus more money in the pocket, outweigh the few poor creature comforts of their grandparents. Above the grocer's shop, in their large, comfortable rooms, lived the grocer, his wife, and their growing-up family. This family was not liked by all. Some said they had ideas above their station in life, chiefly because the children were sent to boarding school. But practically everyone dealt at their shop, for not only was it the only grocery establishment of any size in the place, but the goods sold there could be relied upon. End of CD 3.